Imagine running your hand along a cliff face where the planet has written its autobiography, line by line, grain by grain, each layer a memory of a world that once breathed differently from ours. And then, just when the story becomes most crucial, your fingers catch on a razor-thin boundary in the stone, and everything beneath it goes silent. No gradual change, no fading of species, no slow decline. Just a sharp line where life before ends and life after begins. It is one of the strangest patterns the Earth keeps repeating, and the more closely scientists examine these geological boundaries, the more unsettling they become. Because they are not rare. They are not local. They appear around the world in places separated by oceans and continents, showing the same abrupt changes in fossils, chemistry, and climate. These boundaries mark moments when life shattered and reorganized, when new species emerged and old ones vanished. They are the punctuation marks of deep time, yet the pages between them, the years and decades and centuries after catastrophe, are missing almost entirely. And no matter how hard geologists search, the transitions remain invisible, as if the planet simply refused to record the most dramatic chapters of its own story. Scientists call one of these markers the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary, the line created by the asteroid impact that ended the age of dinosaurs roughly 66 million years ago. If you could kneel beside such a boundary in a quarry or a cliff cut by a river, you would see a layer no thicker than a fingertip, enriched with tiny particles of iridium, an element rare on the surface of the Earth but common in meteorites. Above this thin smear of cosmic dust lie the fossils of mammals, birds, and the first ecosystems of a changed world. Below it lie the final leaves, bones, and shells of the dinosaurs' long reign. There is something unnerving about how precise the line is. We expect the end of worlds to be messy, to leave behind a trail of decline, but in the rock there is nothing like a slow fade. One moment the world is one way, and the next moment it is another. What makes the boundary so mysterious is not the asteroid impact itself. That event, for all its violence, is well documented. The crater is still buried under the Yucatan Peninsula. Shocked quartz and melt glass appear in sediments globally. What disturbs scientists is what comes immediately after. For the first years, perhaps even centuries following the impact, the geological record goes quiet. The deposits that would normally preserve the details of a changing ecosystem are thin, stunted, or missing entirely. Fossils that should record the fragile survivors are almost nowhere to be found. It is as if the Earth tried to forget the trauma as quickly as it occurred. The iridium-rich layer is only the most famous of several geological boundaries that behave this way. There are other extinction lines where a thin sheet of clay separates two completely different worlds. Paleontologists studying these layers often find that the expected intermediate fossils, the transitional species adapting to new climates and landscapes, are simply absent. Instead of gradual transformation, the rock preserves abrupt change. Pollen grains shift suddenly from one ecological regime to another, showing that entire plant communities collapsed and reappeared almost instantly in geological terms. Microfossils, the tiny shells of plankton and microorganisms that settle into sediments year after year, show similar jumps. One kind disappears, another replaces it. The years between those changes remain unrecorded. When geologists try to measure how much time these thin layers represent, the results are startling. In some places, a few millimeters of clay seem to represent thousands of years. A boundary that looks thinner than a page in a book may contain entire generations of life trying to recover from disaster. The compression is not just physical, it is historical. It reflects how violent disturbances disrupt sedimentation itself. During the decades and centuries after an extinction pulse, erosion often dominates. Rivers shift, coastlines retreat or flood. Ash, dust and storm debris accumulate unevenly. Under such chaotic conditions, fossils are far less likely to form. Creatures die in landscapes too turbulent to preserve them, and even when sediments do form, they may later be scoured away by floods or wind before they can be buried deeply enough to survive for millions of years. These missing transitions have puzzled scientists for well over a century. Early geologists in the 19th century debated whether these gaps reflected sudden catastrophes or gradual change that erosion simply failed to record. Catastrophists believe the Earth repeatedly reset itself in dramatic upheavals. Gradualists argued that the gaps were illusions caused by incomplete preservation. Today, the answer seems to lie somewhere between the two. The rock record shows real catastrophes, like asteroid impacts and massive volcanic eruptions, but it also shows long periods where the world was changing faster than sediments could archive it. In other words, abrupt boundaries are real, but the missing centuries between disaster and recovery are also real. Both truths coexist in the stone. Standing before one of these boundary layers, it is difficult not to feel the weight of everything that has been lost. The extinction itself is visible. The aftermath is not. We can point to the impact that ended the Cretaceous, but we cannot reconstruct the first forest that struggled back into the light. We can infer the return of small mammals and birds, but we cannot see their earlier steps into the emptied world. We know ecosystems were remade, but the details of how they were remade are gone. What remains is a thin line, a silence sandwiched between two chapters of a story that should have been continuous. The absence becomes even more striking when we consider how much life must have been happening during those missing years. Plants sprouting in burned landscapes, animals scavenging among fallen trees, rivers carrying silt washed from denuded hillsides. Each of those moments was real. Each represented a decision point in evolution, yet almost none of it fossilized. The Earth resisted turning those fragile years into stone. It preserved the moment of destruction and the moment of recovery, but not the turbulent bridge between them. In a way, these gaps reveal something humbling about deep time. Our planet does not preserve history evenly. It records what is stable, not what is chaotic. It archives long stretches of equilibrium and marks dramatic endings with thin, distinctive signatures, but it struggles to keep the moments when life was scrambling for survival. To the Earth, those years were too brief and too disturbed to leave durable traces. To us, they are the years we most want to understand. This pattern appears across multiple extinction events, not just the end of the Cretaceous. The Impermanent extinction roughly 252 million years ago, the deadliest in Earth's history, shows a similar silence. The oceans lost most of their life, but the early stages of recovery are poorly preserved. The fossil record does not show how communities reassembled in the aftermath. It only shows that they eventually did. The end-Triassic extinction leaves another boundary with missing transitions. Even smaller regional disasters such as volcanic winter episodes or abrupt climate shifts create similar gaps. Time and again, the Earth records the boundary, not the rebuilding. When researchers try to model what happened during these unrecorded intervals, they rely on chemical signatures, sparse microfossils, and rare sediment pockets that escaped erosion. These clues suggest that surviving species often endured long periods of ecological instability. Temperatures swung unpredictably, food chains collapsed and reformed, habitats shrank and expanded. Yet fossils capturing the lives of animals and plants in these unstable worlds remain nearly non-existent. The models describe the struggle. The rock does not show it. there is something almost philosophical about the way the Earth remembers. It keeps the moments when everything changed, but lets go of the moments when life was trying to begin again. The silence between collapse and recovery is part of the story, even though it contains no direct words. It forces us to approach deep time with humility, acknowledging how much we cannot know, how many questions remain unanswered. The gaps are reminders that the history of life is built on both presence and absence. As we trace these thin lines in the rock, we're left with the strange realization that the Earth is not an archivist but a survivor. It keeps the records it can, but it does not promise completeness. The boundaries endure because they mark moments so intense that even erosion cannot erase them. Everything else, the fragile years when forests returned or oceans began to stabilize, fades into geological memory too delicate to last. To understand the history gaps, we must begin by listening to the silences themselves. All right. Hello, fellow sapiens. Sit back, relax, and prepare to step into the lost chapters of Earth. Why do so many history gaps still have no explanation? Tonight we're exploring the places where the planet falls silent, the thin lines in stone where entire worlds vanished and new ones began, without leaving the stories in between. This is Sleepless Homo. Soft science, slow storytelling, and quiet curiosity for tired thinkers who wander through deep time at odd hours. I'm just a humble researcher trying to understand a planet that rarely gives us the full record, only the fragments. Imagine this. The world has just survived an ending. Not the poetic kind, but the physical one, the kind written into stone. An asteroid strikes the planet in a moment so fast that even time seems to recoil from it, and in the bright flash that follows, forests burn, oceans turn turbulent, and the sky becomes a veil of drifting ash. We know the impact happened. The evidence is clear and global. What we do not see are the first years after, the years when the world was breathing through smoke and trying to make sense of itself again. Those years left almost no fossils, hardly any sediments, just scattered chemical fingerprints and distortions in climate records. This absence makes the period strangely haunting. The catastrophe is easy to imagine, the recovery is almost invisible. Scientists realised this when paleoclimate data began to reveal patterns that the fossils themselves could not. Temperature reconstructions from marine sediments and isotopic signatures show that in the immediate aftermath, the Earth plunged into a state of extreme cooling. Sunlight struggled to reach the surface through a high-altitude haze of dust and sulfur. For a time, perhaps for several years, maybe even for a decade, the planet experienced something close to darkness at noon, yet the rock barely records any of this. What followed the impact was a silence in sedimentation that hides far more than it reveals. The evidence suggests that once the dust began to settle, the climate swung in the opposite direction, warming not gradually but erratically, with pronounced jumps that ecosystems were poorly equipped to handle. We can trace these swings in chemical ratios locked inside ancient shells and minerals. What we cannot do is reconstruct them with the clarity we desire. The Earth moved faster than the layers that would have recorded it. The fires that spread after the impact tell another part of the story. Charcoal layers appear in sediments around the world, thin but unmistakable. They reveal that the destruction was not confined to the blast zone. Heat radiated outward across continents, igniting forests thousands of kilometers from the crater. Wildfires swept through ecosystems already weakened by shock waves and falling debris. These fires consumed habitats that had existed since long before the first dinosaurs walked upright. Yet even here the record is uneven. The charcoal tells us that forests burned, but it cannot tell us how long they took to return, which plants came back first, or how animals navigated landscapes reduced to ash. Those details, which must have shaped the earliest chapters of the Paleocene world, dissolved long before they could be preserved. Lakes and soils carry another layer of evidence. Chemical signatures within their sediments show that acid rain followed the impact. The atmospheric sulfur released by the asteroid interacted with moisture in the air, creating corrosive downpours that altered the chemistry of freshwater systems. Lakes became more acidic. Soil nutrients were washed out or rearranged. Microorganisms that maintain ecological balance struggled or vanished. And again, the record is partial. We see the chemical signals, but not the organisms living through them. There are no fossils of the plankton adapting to altered waters, no leaves showing the stress etched into their veins. Instead, we see a shift in pH, an anomaly in mineral ratios, and then a long pause before recovered ecosystems reappear with different species. The oceans, usually reliable archivists of history, also falter here. Microfossils that normally accumulate year after year suddenly become sparse. Foraminifera, tiny shelled organisms that leave behind exquisite records of temperature and chemistry, decline sharply in both abundance and diversity. Their shells thin or break or stop appearing altogether. This signals a collapse in marine food chains. But the sediments that follow, instead of capturing the slow return of life, often show only a renewed layer of more stable fossils millions of years later. The years between remain a blank, an interval where the sea was reorganizing itself in ways the Earth chose not to archive. Modern climate modelling attempts to simulate what happened in this window of time. Researchers feed variables into complex systems that track atmospheric dust, volcanic aerosols, thermal radiation, and ocean circulation. These models suggest that the dust veil produced by the impact could have lingered far longer than once assumed. Instead of days or weeks, it may have dimmed the planet for years, possibly for a decade. If this is correct, then photosynthesis would have nearly halted in some regions. Plants would have struggled to grow. Food webs on land and in water would have collapsed not only from fire and shock, but from sheer lack of sunlight. Yet none of this dramatic reshaping left a clear fossil trail. Sediments from that exact window either never formed or were later eroded away. The world was too unstable to write anything down. This is the part that feels unusually human. The idea that the most transformative period of recovery, the moment when the survivors were reshaping the world and the world was reshaping them, passed by without leaving a durable trace. It is like finding the opening and closing chapters of a book, but realizing that the most important pages, the ones that explain how one world became another, are missing. We know the impact ended the age of dinosaurs. We know mammals diversified afterward. But the bridge between those truths is lost. The animals that endured the immediate aftermath, the first generations born into the dim and cooling world, the first plants to push through scorched earth, all remain shadows we can only glimpse through indirect clues. There is something humbling in this. We tend to imagine Earth as a perfect recorder of its own history, a patient archivist writing everything down in stone. But the evidence suggests something different. The planet remembers stability well. It remembers long eras of equilibrium when sediments accumulate slowly and predictably. It remembers the dramatic boundaries where one era ends and another begins, but it struggles to capture turbulence. The years after the asteroid impact were turbulent beyond anything we can imagine. Storms intensified by temperature gradients may have ripped across continents. Rivers may have changed course repeatedly. Coastlines likely oscillated as sea levels adjusted. Every one of these processes eroded what little sediment tried to form. Life persisted in small, scattered refuges, yet the environments that could have preserved their bones and leaves were either too unstable or too destructive. As scientists examine this period, They often speak with a certain humility. We do not know for certain how long it took for forests to return in different regions. We do not know which species of birds or mammals were the first to flourish in the cleared niches left behind. We do not know which plants developed early adaptations to the acidic soils, or how long marine food chains took to rebuild themselves. These are not mysteries created by neglect or oversight. They are mysteries created by the nature of the earth itself. The rock record is finite. It cannot hold everything. And at the times when life was being transformed most profoundly, the record-keeping system broke down. Yet there is meaning in the silence. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but it is evidence of fragility. It shows that life survives not because the world is stable, but because organisms can endure instability even when the environment refuses to preserve their resilience. Those first years after the impact were likely filled with intense struggle. Species were forced into rapid change. Ecosystems rewired themselves. But because the conditions were so harsh, the traces of this struggle disappeared before they could be fossilized. The most important transformations happened in a geological blink, and the planet moved on. Perhaps that is why this period feels so strangely intimate. The world was recovering from trauma, not metaphorically, but literally. It was a time when the ordinary rules of sedimentation did not apply, when the earth was reshaping itself too quickly to leave an orderly archive. It leaves us with a sense of deep humility. We can reconstruct the impact with remarkable precision. We can measure the crater. We can calculate the dust. But when we seek to understand the years when life was trying to begin again, we find ourselves staring into a silence that will never fully yield its secrets. But gaps in deep time are mirrored by gaps in human time, and those are even stranger. If you enjoy these calm late-night journeys, a gentle like or subscribe helps other sleepless minds find this space. And I'd love to know, where are you listening from, and how? Drifting off in bed, working through the night. If you fall asleep, timestamps will guide you back to where you last remember being awake. All right, let's continue, and as always, stay curious, stay calm. You're standing at the base of one of humanity's first cities, not in the comfort of hindsight, not with a map of ancient civilizations already drawn in your mind, but in the moment it first rose from dust. The walls are high, the irrigation canals engineered with a confidence that suggests centuries of iterative labour, and the administrative seals found in nearby rooms show symbols arranged with the assurance of a scribbled tradition already comfortable with abstraction. And yet when archaeologists dig beneath these first urban layers, expecting earlier foundations, expecting the messy prototypes of civilization, they find something unexpected. Very little. There are long stretches of sparse settlement, long horizons of low-density habitation that do not resemble stepping stones toward an urban world. Then suddenly, above those quiet layers, cities appear almost fully formed, as if someone had turned a page rather than built a world grain by grain. This is the puzzle that greets those who study the earliest architecture of humanity, a dawn that seems to arrive without the gradual light before it. When radiocarbon dates are plotted from these early sites, the clusters fall not across a gentle slope of increasing complexity, but in a tight band that marks the earliest true city layers. Below them are centuries, sometimes millennia, of scattered hearths and modest structures, the kinds of human traces that whisper rather than speak. Then above them emerge fortified walls, storage facilities, standardized bricks, and planned street grids. The revelation is straightforward but unsettling. The first places we call cities do not sit on top of clear developmental ancestors. They appear abruptly, so abruptly that even seasoned archaeologists express caution when explaining the transition. We do not know for certain what social dynamics led to such a sudden reorganization of life, but the evidence suggests that whatever happened did not leave behind gradual architectural prototypes in any recognizable sequence. The story that was supposed to unfold slowly instead jumps. Excavations at early Mesopotamian sites provide some of the clearest examples. Beneath the oldest monumental constructions at places like Uruk are long stretches of settlement that bear no obvious preparation for the scale of urban life that followed. The radiocarbon dates do not scatter across a wide upward arc, but instead cluster tightly in layers representing the 4th millennium before the Common Era. Archaeologists working at the base of these sites often remark on how thin the preceding layers appear relative to the dense urban deposits above. It is as though a long period of relative stillness was interrupted by a sudden concentration of people, labour, and administrative ambition. Similar patterns appear in the earliest urban centres of the Indus Valley. There, beneath the carefully laid brick platforms and drainage systems for which the civilization is famous, sit earlier layers that do not show the expected half-formed iterations of their later engineering. The irrigation systems that emerged during this early urban period appear already scaled, with channels cut precisely enough to require coordinated labour and planning. We do not know what earlier experiments might have existed or where they took place, but the archaeological record beneath these cities does not yet reveal them. This abruptness extends to the earliest evidence of administrative control. When early tablets and seals appear, they arrive not as hesitant markings, but as systems already employing cataloguing, identity symbols, and what appears to be standardized recording. In Mesopotamia, where clay tablets become the medium of the earliest proto-writing, the first examples carry numerical signs and commodity lists that suggest a pre-existing tradition of bookkeeping. Yet when archaeologists search for the scribal stages that must precede these forms, the layers beneath remain quiet. No half-formed symbols, no experimental script scratched uncertainly into clay, no archives of trial and error. Instead, the earliest meaningful marks are already functional, used in economic and administrative contexts. This pattern repeats in other regions. In Egypt, by the time writing appears around the late 4th millennium before the Common Era, it is already a tool of state-level administration. The expected earlier attempts at writing remain elusive. The material record of early metallurgy shows similar leaps. In regions where copper working first becomes extensive, the earliest metal objects appear to have been produced by smiths who already understood melting points, casting methods, and alloying. The first copper tools recovered from early city layers in Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and the Indus do not resemble the crude, experimental pieces one might expect from pioneers in metallurgy. Some of the earliest objects suggest knowledge of smelting techniques too refined to be early-stage attempts. Radiocarbon dates from associated layers indicate that these objects emerged during periods when settlements were increasing in density, but again the archaeological staircase of prior experimentation remains elusive. There are clear metallurgical traditions that follow, spreading across regions in the 3rd millennium before the Common Era, but the earliest steps are missing. It is as if the first metallurgists appear on the page fully literate in their craft. Stratigraphy deepens this puzzle. Across multiple early city sites, long intervals of sparse or intermittent occupation sit directly beneath the first dense urban deposits. Excavators often describe these lower layers as quiet landscapes dotted with low-intensity settlement, seasonal exploitation, or small-scale domestic structures. Then above them, almost without warning, appear thick layers of construction debris, clay brick collapse, refuse mounds, and industrial waste. These upper layers indicate stable residence by thousands of people, and yet the long quiet beneath them does not easily explain where the knowledge required to build such settlements was forged. There is no doubt that humans had the capacity to innovate, organize, and collaborate, but the visible record between scattered habitation and dense urbanism remains narrower than expected. The realization that emerges from these excavations is not dramatic but deeply humbling. Humanity's first cities do not grow from long archaeological gradients. They rise like monoliths. They appear as complex worlds whose earlier chapters remain largely unwritten in the soil beneath them. We do not know for certain whether the missing steps lie in yet undiscovered sites, in regions where sedimentation was unfavourable for preservation, or in mobile communities whose innovations left fewer durable traces. But the material evidence we currently possess suggests a story of unexpected acceleration. When cities appear, they do so with architectural, agricultural, and administrative confidence rather than hesitance. They stand as reminders that complexity may gather for centuries, in ways the archaeological record does not always capture, and then express itself suddenly in forms that seem to have no prototypes. This abruptness has implications for how we understand early civilizations. It suggests that the organizational structures behind the first cities may have been more fluid and flexible than stone and clay can record. It raises questions about whether communities experimented with complex administration in organic, ephemeral ways long before they built dense settlements. It reminds us that humanity's earliest attempts at irrigation, metallurgy, and writing might have occurred in context where preservation was unlikely, leaving only the mature versions visible today. And perhaps most importantly, it cautions us not to mistake the absence of evidence for the absence of learning. The first cities may rise like monoliths in the archaeological record, but the lives that preceded them were likely full of incremental experiments whose traces we have not yet found. And where human complexity appears abruptly, disappearance follows just as sharply. What becomes even more striking is how this sudden emergence of cities leaves uneven footprints across different regions. In some valleys, the first urban layers rise sharply, an unmistakable jump from scattered households to dense architecture. In others, the shift appears more like a soft threshold, where population seems to pulse upward without leaving clear evidence of the mechanisms behind that change. Archaeologists have noted that these uneven footprints do not correspond neatly to climate, soil fertility, or available resources. Instead, they appear as patterns of human decision-making, choices made by groups whose motivations we can infer only from the material traces they left behind. Some communities embraced concentrated settlement, while neighbouring groups continued living in looser distributions for centuries. What drove such divergent paths is unclear. The archaeological record hints at social factors we cannot fully reconstruct. Alliances, rivalries, ceremonies, or forms of cooperation whose signatures did not fossilise. Another layer of this puzzle comes from early storage and subsistence infrastructure. When granaries first appear in these initial cities, they do so at a scale that implies sophisticated knowledge of surplus management. Grain silos and storage platforms built of mud brick or stone show standardized dimensions, often repeated across a site. Yet the steps leading from household-level storage to communal or institutional storage remain faint. There are almost no intermediate structures, no half-sized or experimental prototypes that would reveal a gradual transition. Instead, we see a sudden reorganization of the labour in which harvest began to flow into central facilities. This shift likely required negotiation, coordination, and a sense of shared purpose or obligation. But the archaeological layers beneath these storage complexes reveal little about how those social agreements were formed. There is also a linguistic puzzle embedded in the earliest inscriptions. When the first written signs appear, they do not read like private reflections or informal markings. They read like tools of administration, tallies, allocations, inventories. The scripts begin with bureaucracy rather than storytelling. This has led some scholars to observe that writing may have been formalized in contexts that privileged durability and precision, leaving behind almost no trace of the earlier, ephemeral forms of record-keeping that would have been used at household or small community levels. Marks made on wood, textiles, soft clay, or perishable surfaces could have carried the early experiments we now lack. In that sense, the sudden appearance of mature administrative writing may not reflect the beginning of literacy, but merely the moment when literacy became durable enough for archaeologists to find. What remains consistent across these lines of evidence is that humanity's transition into urban life was neither linear nor uniform. Each region followed its own trajectory, shaped by decisions, innovations, and pressures that do not always leave visible pathways. The stillness beneath the first cities, those long quiet layers with sparse remains, may reflect a world where experimentation took forms that simply did not fossilize, and when enough knowledge, confidence, and circumstance gathered, complexity surfaced all at once, leaving us with cities that stand at the top of enigmatic foundations. Picture a moment when a civilization still appears whole on the surface. The markets are open, the granaries stocked, the rituals practiced in the same courtyards where generations have gathered. Scribes sit at their clay tables, styluses in hand, writing the routine movements of grain, livestock, and labour. Nothing in these records hints that the world around them is beginning to thin. No one inscribes the first rumours of failing harvests or fraying alliances. Yet when archaeologists sift through the last documents these societies left behind, they discover something almost eerie. The records stop not after the destruction, not after the palaces fall or the wells run dry, but just before. The final tablets, seals, and inscriptions sit on shelves or floors, as if put down with the intention of being picked up again. They never were. It is as though the moment a civilization begins to fracture is the moment it loses the ability to describe itself. The revelation becomes clearest when examining the last decades of the Bronze Age world. Across the Aegean, linear B tablets track rations, livestock counts, and shipments of bronze. They show administrators dividing resources and preparing for demands they do not name. Then, unexpectedly, the archive ends. The last tablets from Pylos were baked accidentally in the fire that destroyed the palace. They describe routine allocations, not impending crisis. There is no reference to the threat that later archaeologists infer from fortification walls and destruction layers. The scribes did not record a collapse. They recorded normal life until the moment the writing stopped. A similar silence stretches across the Indus Valley. The script that once appeared on seals and storage tags becomes scarce in the centuries before the cities are abandoned. The administrative marks, tiny, precise symbols that once tracked goods and identities, fade from the archaeological sequence long before the settlements empty. In Egypt, the inscriptions carved during years of low Nile floods become sparse and sometimes disappear entirely. Reliefs that had once celebrated abundance or divine favour fall silent when the river fails to rise. Across the Near East, palace archives cut off mid-correspondence. Trade letters stop in the middle of negotiations. Inventories sit unfinished. And when trade networks break, the records of exchange cease, even before the goods stop moving. Each of these places shows the same pattern. The moment history becomes fragile, the record collapses first. Looking closely at the Linear B tablets, archaeologists find that the final texts describe allocations of bronze, listings of workers, and preparations for festivals. None of them mention the fires that would soon engulf the palaces. The scribes were working until the very end, but they seem not to have been chroniclers of crisis. Their role was to record the stable functioning of the palace economy, not to narrate its unravelling. That silence is not an omission. It is the natural result of a system whose writing existed to support administration, not to interpret the world. In the Indus Valley, the disappearance of the script from late levels suggests a similar shift. The people of these cities may have continued living, trading, and adapting, but the administrative framework that produced inscriptions had diminished. Without that framework, the script vanished from the material record even though the community persisted. In Egypt, inscriptions respond to political or religious imperatives rather than ecological upheaval. When the Nile's annual cycle faltered, the state's capacity to commission monumental texts contracted. The absence of inscriptions reflects institutional limits rather than an absence of crisis. Near Eastern archives reveal still another dimension. Many sets of letters end abruptly as though scribes were interrupted. The palace at Amar, for example, preserves tablets that appear to break off mid-sentence. They were never resumed. Trade documents, which once tracked shipments across the Mediterranean and Near East, also vanish before the full network collapses. When copper, tin, and grain still move from port to port, the written records of their exchange stopped. This suggests that the administrative infrastructure failed before commerce did. Merchants may have continued moving goods informally, relying on verbal agreements or personal trust, leaving archaeologists with fewer written traces. The collapse of scribal systems thus preceded the collapse of the economies they supported. This sequence appears counterintuitive at first, but it reflects how dependent record-keeping was on centralized authority. When central institutions weakened, the writing they sponsored weakened first. The realization that emerges from these fragmented endings is sobering. Civilizations rarely describe their own unravelling. The mechanisms that produce inscriptions, tablets, or seals depend on stability, surplus, and ritualized order. When these conditions erode, writing is among the first practices to be lost. That silence is not intentional. It is structural. A collapsing society is not one that suddenly decides not to write, but one that loses the capacity to maintain the administrative and political frameworks that make writing possible. As a result, archaeologists encounter long narratives of prosperity followed by abrupt silence. The centuries in which fear, uncertainty, or improvisation must have dominated daily life leave almost no textual trace. The only witness that survives is the absence itself. To see why the record fails, we must understand how fragile the act of recording always was. What deepens this silence is how consistently it appears across societies that never interacted. In early Anatolia, for instance, the last tablets from Hattusa record shipments, assignments, and ceremonial offerings with the same steady tone seen in other palace economies. There is no indication that the capital of the Hittite Empire is about to be abandoned, yet within a short span, its archives are left scattered on floors, half buried in ash and debris. The storage rooms that once held thousands of tablets show clear signs of rapid desertion. Some tablets were placed carefully on shelves as if their scribes expected to return the next morning. Others lie in heaps, covered by collapsed roofing. What we lack is the middle layer between functioning bureaucracy and ruins, the moments when an empire changed from administrative precision to quiet evacuation. That middle layer is simply gone. In the Caucasus and northern Mesopotamia, Researchers studying smaller city-states notice a similar pattern. Letters that once travelled along well-established routes between rulers stop abruptly. The handwriting of scribes, once stable and recognisable, trails off without replacement. We do not find later hastily written messages attempting to restore order. Instead, we find the ending of communication networks long before the ending of habitation. This indicates not only political instability, but also the collapse of the schools that taught scribes to write in the first place. Without continuous training, a literate class can disappear within 2 or 3 generations. Excavations at sites like Nutsi and Alalak show that scribble schools were among the first institutions to dissolve. When that happened, the written record dissolved with them. Archaeologists working in the Levant encounter another layer of this puzzle. Entire archives sealed away by accident. Some storerooms were buried beneath collapsed floors or sealed behind walls, not as acts of preservation, but as consequences of structural destruction. These sealed archives often contain routine documents, not warnings. They show communities functioning normally in the years before upheaval, with no surviving written attempt to document the shift toward crisis. The silence is therefore not just the absence of writing, but the absence of writing that acknowledges change. That absence shapes how we reconstruct these past worlds, leaving historians to infer the unravelling from burned layers, unburied skeletons, or the sudden cessation of imported goods. In South Asia, sediment layers from the later phases of the Indus civilization show signs of shifting river courses and environmental stress. Yet the absence of inscriptions extends even before these geological changes become prominent. We do not know whether administrative systems slowly eroded, whether people shifted to oral agreements, or whether writing was simply no longer tied to essential economic activities. What we can say is that the quiet spaces in the archaeological record correspond not to stability, but to transition. The people living through these changes were adapting, but their adaptations did not involve leaving written explanations behind. Instead, their world shifted through pathways the material record struggles to capture. Altered trade habits, changing rituals, new forms of community identity, none of which require durable writing. There is also the unsettling reality that some civilizations recorded their decline in media that did not survive. Perishable writing materials such as wooden tablets, leather scrolls, or ink on papyrus would have disappeared in environments prone to humidity, insects, or fires. We find hints of these lost records in the few surviving scraps: charred fragments of wood with markings, traces of ink on pottery, or scribal palettes without inscriptions. These objects suggest that writing existed beyond what clay or stone can preserve, but even this fragile evidence disappears precisely during transitional decades. When economies faltered, the ability to acquire specialized materials for writing likely contracted, and with fewer scribes trained to maintain those traditions, the perishable records that might have described crises were never produced or preserved. What remains is a repeated pattern. Eras of flourishing leave abundant archives, while eras of transformation leave almost none. This imbalance shapes our understanding of history, giving the false impression that societies moved smoothly from one period to another. In truth, the decades when everything changed are the decades we can see the least. The silence is not only archaeological but human. People facing uncertainty rarely produce the kinds of records that survive millennia. They improvise, they relocate, they adapt in ways that leave minimal durable trace. And it is this human quietness beneath the structural silence that makes these forgotten decades so difficult to reconstruct. A library without walls, stretching across continents, filled with the written memories of countless communities who never imagined their words would vanish. In this vast landscape of human expression, every tool of writing was an act of faith. Clay pressed with reeds, ink brushed onto papyrus, characters carved into birch bark or painted onto palm leaves, each mark carried the same hope, that someone in the future would read it. And yet the survival of these records was never determined by the importance of the ideas they held, but by the stubbornness of the materials themselves. Clay could survive fire, flood, and time. Papyrus could not survive humidity. Bamboo split and unravelled beneath monsoons. Birch peeled and decayed when exposed to rain. For every archive that endured, countless others dissolved quietly in the very environments that sustained the people who produced them. When we walk through the ruins of ancient cities today, we are not just moving through abandoned rooms. We are moving through the ghost shelves of vanished libraries we will never read. The revelation becomes clear when we follow the trail of what survived. In regions where clay was abundant, administrative tablets endured even when cities collapsed. In Mesopotamia, the archives of the early second millennium before the Common Era still lie in dense stacks where scribes left them, their surfaces hardened by the fires that destroyed the buildings around them. What might have been a tragedy for those scribes became a gift for archaeologists thousands of years later. Fire turned fragile clay into permanent stone, but places that relied on papyrus or bark or palm leaf were not granted the same unintended preservation. Their archives vanished quietly, often without a trace. The result is a skewed landscape of human memory, where entire traditions appear to rise suddenly, not because they were young, but because their earlier stages were written on materials that did not survive. The distinction between clay and papyrus becomes a fault line across the ancient world. Clay tablets endured by accident, papyrus endured only by miracle. In humid regions, papyrus decayed within decades unless it was sealed in exceptionally dry or protected spaces. In tropical zones, bamboo and palm leaf manuscripts began to deteriorate almost immediately. This is why we possess detailed administrative records from Sumer, yet have almost nothing comparable from the early civilizations of Southeast Asia, even though we know their cultures were rich in storytelling, trade, and ritual. We do not know for certain how vast their written traditions were, but the evidence suggests they were substantial. They vanished simply because they breathed in wetter air. Even the archives that did survive fire were not always lucky. During periods of economic strain, clay tablets were often recycled. Scribal workshops scraped away older texts, rewrote new messages over them, or crushed broken tablets to mix into fresh clay. Whole eras of correspondence were repurposed into bricks that now form the walls of ancient buildings. Each reused tablet represents not just a lost record, but a lost conversation, a lost decision, a lost glimpse into a world that understood itself differently from the one that followed. Meanwhile, in Egypt, many scrolls from the early and middle periods were stored in wooden chests that decayed long before later scribes catalogued them. Only the pieces buried in desert cliffside tombs or sealed in accidental caches survived. These are the fragments we use to reconstruct vast literary traditions that once filled libraries but are now reduced to small and uneven samples. Organic inks introduced another vulnerability. When fire swept through archives containing scrolls, the carbonization process often erased writing long before it converted material into a preservable state. Archaeologists excavating sites in the Mediterranean frequently find lumps of carbonized papyrus or parchment that preserve the form of a scroll, but none of its meaning. The ink dissolved or fused with the substrate in ways that make it unreadable. Even with modern imaging, it's the shape of memory without its content. Such objects remind us that many manuscripts did not simply disappear. They transformed into shadows of themselves. In South and Southeast Asia, the climate was even less forgiving. palm leaf manuscripts, once widespread across large regions of the subcontinent, survived only when continuously copied by scribes onto fresh leaves. This tradition ensured continuity but erased the earliest versions. Not a single first-generation manuscript survives. In China, early bamboo and wooden slips survive in rare, waterlogged or desert conditions. These caches reveal glimpses of philosophical, administrative and astronomical knowledge that must have been widespread, yet we hold only a small portion. The earliest chapters of these intellectual traditions vanished, not because they were unimportant, but because the materials they were written on surrendered to the climate almost immediately. The rarity of early codices adds another layer. In the Mediterranean, early bound books were experimental forms used by small circles of scholars. Most communities continued to rely on scrolls, which were far more vulnerable. When libraries in the Hellenistic and Roman worlds burned, codices had a chance to survive because of their structure, yet scrolls disintegrated rapidly in heat or humidity. Thus, entire genres of early poetry, science, and political theory appear to have been erased long before later historians tried to compile them. What remains are the survivors of format rather than the survivors of thought. The realization that follows is both quiet and profound. The unevenness of the historical record is not a reflection of how much happened or how much people knew. It is a reflection of which materials could outlast climate, disaster, and chance. Manuscripts were acts of hope written on fragile surfaces. When we speak of history gaps, we are not speaking of empty centuries, but of centuries whose pages were made of dust, ink, and fibre that could not outlast the environments that nurtured them. In this sense, the past is shaped as much by what people wrote as what they wrote on. But history gaps are not only material, they begin deeper in memory and meaning. This uneven preservation becomes even more striking when we look at regions where writing flourished, but archaeological conditions were unforgiving. In West Africa, for example, early written traditions relied on leather-bound manuscripts and ink on wooden boards. These materials were perfectly suited to the intellectual and religious practices of the time, yet almost completely unsuitable for long-term survival in humid climates. The earliest phases of Saharan scholarship, which must have been vibrant during the centuries when caravan routes were expanding, survive only through later copies made in drier regions. What this tells us is that the existence of writing does not guarantee the endurance of written memory. A culture may have been fully literate, but if its environment erased the material traces, historians receive only a late echo of what was once widespread. The libraries of the ancient Mediterranean reveal another dimension of this fragility. The famous collections of Alexandria and Pergamon were supported by scribes who copied texts continuously, not because the originals were rare, but because the originals decayed so quickly. Papyrus needed unbroken chains of recopying to survive. When political instability disrupted these chains, even briefly, manuscripts disappeared in clusters. Many scientific works from the early Hellenistic world are known only through summaries made centuries later. Their original arguments, diagrams, and experimental descriptions vanished because a single generation of scribes was unable to maintain the copying rhythm. The disappearance was not dramatic. It happened through neglect, humidity, insects, and the slow unravelling of an intellectual infrastructure that depended on trained hands and stable patronage. In the Americas, where writing traditions developed in forms suited to their specific environments, we see yet another pattern. The Maya carved inscriptions on durable stone, which survived, but they also wrote lengthy codices on bark paper coated with lime plaster. Only 4 of these codices survive today, preserved mostly by accident in rare conditions that protected them from moisture and fire. Archaeologists suspect that thousands once existed across major city-states. The absence of the others profoundly limits our understanding of Maya astronomy, mythology, and governance. Without the bark paper archives, we see only the monumental record, not the daily intellectual life that must have supported it. Once again, the survival of an entire intellectual tradition depended on the luck of material resilience, rather than the brilliance of the ideas themselves. Northern Europe offers a contrasting story. Early Germanic and Celtic communities used wooden tablets, wax surfaces, and temporary runic carvings on organic materials. Very few of these survived. Even the celebrated rune stones of Scandinavia represent only a late and monumentalized phase of a much older writing culture that originally relied on perishable materials. Archaeologists infer the presence of these earlier phases from indirect clues, references in later sagas, the distribution of carving tools, and the occasional discovery of waterlogged wooden fragments with faint runic marks. These rare survivals hint at traditions far older and broader than the surviving corpus suggests. In East Asia, the discovery of waterlogged Zhou and Qin bamboo slips has completely reshaped our understanding of early Chinese thought. Before these caches were unearthed, scholars assumed many philosophical schools appeared abruptly during the late first millennium before the Common Era. The slips revealed that earlier, more gradual developments had been written down but lost for over 2,000 years. Their survival depended entirely on the accident of being sealed in wet anaerobic soil. Had the soil been slightly drier or the pits slightly more exposed to seasonal shifts, these foundational manuscripts would have dissolved and remained unknown. This shows how easily philosophical lineages can appear sudden, simply because their earliest written layers did not endure. When we step back from all these cases, a pattern emerges that is neither comforting nor fully resolvable. The survival of human memory is not governed by what mattered most to the people who produced it. It is governed by chemistry, climate, coincidence, and the blind mechanics of decay. The written world we inherit is a narrow slice carved out by material durability. The worlds we have lost are immeasurable in comparison, and yet the fragility of these materials may explain why so much of human knowledge was carried forward through repeated telling rather than written permanence. Communities adapted their stories to mediums that could be renewed. Voices, rituals, and teachings embodied in memory rather than fixed on surfaces that could burn or rot. Far from being empty, these vanished shelves remind us that the human record was once fuller, broader, and more diverse than the surviving fragments imply. What we possess is not the complete library of our ancestors, but the handful of volumes that managed to outrun time. A civilization at its height, humming with the quiet machinery of scribes, masons, metallurgists, farmers, and traders. Its streets are crowded, its fields productive, its temples and palaces rising in stone like statements of confidence carved into the earth. Everything seems permanent, everything seems inevitable. Yet behind that impression of stability lies a truth far less comforting. A society can become more complex than the people who inhabit it can sustain, and when that threshold is crossed, even the smallest disruption becomes enough to unravel centuries of achievement. The archaeological record hints at this again and again, not through dramatic inscriptions or confessions from those who lived through collapse, but through the sudden disappearance of skills that once shaped entire worlds. What if I told you that civilizations fell not only because storms or droughts arrived, but because the delicate knowledge networks that held them together were stretched thinner than anyone understood? Archaeologists who study systemic fragility have noted a pattern across ancient landscapes. the most vibrant societies depended on highly specialized groups whose abilities could not easily be replaced. The record of early Mesopotamia shows small clusters of scribes managing vast administrative burdens, producing tablets that tracked everything from grain distribution to diplomatic correspondence. Metallurgists worked in restricted workshops, often guarding methods that involve precise temperatures, carefully sourced ores, and generational expertise. We do not know for certain whether these specialists felt their importance or feared their scarcity, but the evidence suggests that when disruptions came, their knowledge was among the first to vanish. In some palace archives, the final tablets display hurried handwriting or inconsistent signs, as if written by apprentices suddenly thrust into roles their teachers once filled with confidence. A similar pattern appears in early metallurgical centres, where slag composition shifts abruptly, indicating that ore refinement became less controlled just before production ceased entirely. These fragilities were amplified by long-distance trade networks that required political stability to function. Archaeological surveys of the 3rd millennium before the Common Era reveal how goods flowed across astonishing distances. Copper might travel from Oman to the Indus, while lapis lazuli moved from Afghanistan toward the cities of Sumer. Timber floated down rivers from Lebanon into Egyptian workshops. These connections were not optional luxuries. They were the arteries that supplied the materials necessary for urban life. When regional conflicts emerged, or when a kingdom lost control of a key port, whole sectors of society faltered. Excavations at certain urban sites show layers of abandoned kilns and unused moulds, signs that local industries collapsed when imported materials no longer arrived. A single missing link could disrupt an entire chain of production, and no local ingenuity could replace a lost resource quickly enough. Monumental architecture offers another window into this imbalance. To build a ziggurat, a pyramid, or a palace required not only skilled workers, but complex logistical systems. Stone had to be quarried, transported, shaped, lifted, and placed under coordinated supervision. The administrative structures behind these projects were vast. Yet once the bureaucratic core weakened, even slightly, monumental construction stopped almost immediately. Archaeologists often find unfinished foundations or abandoned stone blocks, as if workers walked away mid-task. The absence of later modifications suggests that the knowledge to restart such projects had evaporated. The generation trained to manage these undertakings was gone, and the system that once supported them could not be easily rebuilt. Agricultural intensification adds another layer to the story. Ancient societies pushed their landscapes to produce more food than ever before through irrigation canals, terracing, and complex water management. These innovations allowed populations to grow, but they also introduced vulnerabilities. Irrigation required coordination. Terraces needed maintenance across entire mountainsides. When climate anomalies occurred, such as multi-year droughts, regions that had become dependent on these systems faced devastating consequences. Pollen analysis from several ancient lake beds shows abrupt declines in cultivated species during climatic downturns, followed by increases in weed growth. This shift marks not only ecological stress, but the collapse of human-managed landscapes. Once the people maintaining these systems were forced to leave or died, the land returned to a different equilibrium, one that required far less human involvement. Yet perhaps the most subtle and haunting evidence of complexity exceeding its keepers lies in demographic shifts. When populations moved suddenly due to conflict or environmental stress, institutional memory vanished with them. Administrative buildings could remain intact, but without the individuals who understood how to operate them, they became useless. Archaeologists sometimes find entire storage rooms filled with tools that appear untouched after abandonment. suggesting that the people who once relied on those objects never returned. Written documents that remain are often incomprehensible, without the context once known to the communities who produced them. Even the most carefully made object becomes mute when its meaning is no longer shared. Taken together, these strands of evidence reveal a simple but unsettling truth. Complexity carries invisible costs. Every added layer of administrative structure, every new technology, every expanded trade route, every intricate irrigation canal increases a society's dependence on knowledge that must be transmitted reliably across generations. When transmission falters, collapse becomes not just possible, but likely. The most advanced civilizations were often the most vulnerable because their stability depended on fragile networks that could not withstand sudden disruption. Whether through conflict, climate, or internal strain, once specialists disappeared, the world they sustained dimmed almost instantly. We do not know for certain how people understood these moments of unravelling. No surviving text tells us what a young scribe felt when he realised he was the last in his lineage to read certain signs. No inscription records the moment when a metallurgist noticed that the ore arriving from a distant mine had stopped coming. But the archaeological record shows us the consequences. Tools were left unused, workshops fell silent, canals silted over. The very skills that once defined a civilization evaporated faster than the structures they built. In that evaporation lies much of the silence we now confront when we study the past. Knowledge does not die with stone or clay. It dies with people, and once lost, it rarely returns in the same form. When we think of collapse, we often imagine dramatic scenes of violence or flames. Yet the more common reality was far quieter. A teacher died without passing on his method. A caravan route was abandoned. A generation grew up without learning the skills their parents assumed they would inherit. Collapse was often the accumulation of small absences rather than any single overwhelming event. And in those absences we find the gaps that challenge us today. Gaps created not by catastrophe alone, but by the delicate nature of knowledge itself. Debts of complexity were repaid in silence. A society that relied on trades and skills, held by a small fraction of its population, could not survive when that fraction disappeared. The archaeological record preserves the structures, but the living knowledge that animated them proves far less durable. We sift through the ruins of collapsed worlds knowing that what we see represents only a fraction of what once existed. The rest was carried in minds and hands now long gone, leaving behind questions that archaeology can approach but never fully answer. Yet some of Earth's greatest gaps lie not in civilizations, but in the living world itself. What the archaeological record also reveals, in its own quiet way, is how unevenly knowledge was held within ancient societies. In many regions, entire technologies depended on a handful of individuals whose names we will never know. Excavations at certain metallurgical sites show workstations arranged around a single central furnace, with tool marks so consistent that they appear to have come from one master and a few apprentices. When those central figures vanished, the remaining traces show attempts to imitate techniques they no longer fully understood. Alloy proportions drift. Casting moulds become irregular. This is not failure on the part of the learners. It is the simple fact that some realms of expertise require decades of lived practice, something that no amount of imitation can rescue once the last bearer is gone. Other kinds of knowledge were even more fragile. Some early civilizations relied heavily on oral transmission for engineering principles. Techniques for constructing reed boats, binding timber, or choosing foundation stones were often taught through apprenticeships that left little written trace. In regions where writing existed but was limited to administrative functions, technical knowledge lived almost entirely in bodies and memory. Archaeologists studying collapsed harbours or abandoned granaries sometimes find evidence that buildings were repaired or modified incorrectly in the years leading up to abandonment, as if the builders retained the general concept but not the critical sequence of steps. A beam placed slightly off-centre, a supporting wall angled just enough to crack under strain. These mistakes are small, almost invisible in isolation, yet they reveal how subtle the line is between stable engineering and structures destined to fail. Another layer of fragility emerges when we examine ancient climate data. Across multiple regions, we see signs of societies pushing their agricultural systems toward the limits of what the landscape could sustain. Soil cores from river valleys show alternating layers of rich sediment and exhausted earth, suggesting cycles of overuse followed by sudden abandonment. Once a field lost its fertility, the knowledge required to rehabilitate it often did not exist or was too costly to apply at scale. Shortly afterward, we see evidence of demographic contraction. Whether caused by famine, migration, or both, the loss of population further eroded the knowledge infrastructure. A smaller community cannot maintain the irrigation networks once designed for a far larger population. The canals silt, the terraces erode, and with each passing season, the expertise tied to those systems becomes less relevant, then forgotten altogether. Trade, too, had hidden consequences that only became visible during collapse. When a society becomes accustomed to importing certain tools or resources, local production slowly withers. The arrival of finely worked obsidian blades or bronze tools from distant regions made local craftsmanship unnecessary. Over time, the knowledge to mine, smelt, or shape similar materials disappeared. Archaeologists find sites that once produced high-quality tools but gradually shifted to simple, utilitarian forms even before collapse, as imported items displace local traditions. When the trade routes broke, these societies were left with neither imports nor the skills to recreate what had once been commonplace. In such moments, the complexity that once enabled flourishing left behind only absence. And woven through all these layers is a pattern we see repeatedly in the archaeological record. The final generation in a collapsing system often inherits the appearance of stability without the underlying coherence. They walk through palaces still intact, fields still green, workshops still bright with activity. But the deeper structures, knowledge networks, exchange routes, climatic rhythms, have already begun to fracture. We do not know how conscious these individuals were of the approaching limits. The evidence does not tell us whether they felt the uncertainty beneath their feet. But the layers that follow show us how quickly a world can change when a society's continuity depends on expertise held by too few. In the end, collapse comes quietly to complex societies not because they lacked intelligence or ingenuity, but because the scaffolding of their world exceeded the ability of any single generation to maintain it. Knowledge, once stretched thin, becomes brittle, and when it snaps, the silence that follows is not empty but full of the ghosts of skills once held in living hands. You are holding a slab of ancient stone no thicker than your hand, and in it lies a moment when life on Earth seemed to leap forward without warning. One layer shows simple traces, faint impressions left by creatures with no skeletons and no clear hierarchy. And then, in the layer above, the world changes. Animals with articulated limbs, complex eyes, hardened shells, and organised body plans suddenly appear as though they arrived fully formed in a single geological breath. It is a scene that repeats across the fossil record, not just in the deep oceans of the Cambrian period, but in the quiet mudstones of ancient river valleys, in the warm coastal shelves where early mammals once walked, and in the volcanic basins where the first primates cast their shadows. Again and again, life seems to step forward without leaving the long trail we expect to find behind it. We know evolution does not work this way. Change accumulates slowly through countless generations, yet the rock record presents us with these abrupt arrivals, as if the ancestors were there but too quiet, too delicate, or too poorly preserved to leave their names in stone. What paleontology reveals, with a kind of humbled precision, is that many of these sudden appearances coincide with gaps in sediment or conditions that were unfriendly to fossilization. The first animals of the Cambrian explosion emerge in rocks that preserved hard parts, but rarely their soft-bodied predecessors. The earliest horses appear in deposits that contain only fragments of their smaller, more ancient relatives, making the lineage feel discontinuous even though genetic evidence confirms their long descent. The first bats glide into the record already capable of powered flight, their bones so fine and specialized that the transitional forms between ground-dwelling mammals and aerial insect hunters might have lived in environments that never fossilized them. We do not know for certain what the missing chapters looked like. We only know that the transitions must have been real, even if the layers that held their traces have not survived. Consider the Cambrian period, more than 500 million years ago. Before its famous explosion of forms, the world was home to organisms so soft and delicate that their bodies rarely endured the pressures of fossilization. When the conditions changed and minerals began to replace tissues with greater fidelity, what we see is not the first appearance of complexity, but the first appearance of preservation. The fossil record gives us trilobites with their segmented armour, anomalocaridids with grasping appendages, and sponges with intricate internal scaffolding. But it gives us barely a whisper of the simpler creatures from which they evolved. When paleontologists examine rock layers from the period immediately before this expansion, they often find microbial mats and ambiguous impressions, but little that connects directly to the new forms above. It is like arriving at a story halfway through the first chapter, knowing the introduction once existed but lacking its pages. The same pattern is visible in the early history of mammals. When we look at the first horses in the Eocene period, we see small, forest-dwelling animals with toes instead of hooves, large eyes adapted to dappled light, and teeth suited to soft leaves. Yet their earliest ancestors leave only scattered fragments in older sediments, making it difficult to reconstruct the gradual shifts that led to the more specialized animals we find later. Some regions show transitions clearly, but many do not. The sediments were either too coarse, too acidic, too disturbed by water flow, or not deposited quickly enough to preserve fragile bones. It is not that transitional horses did not exist. It is that the landscapes they inhabited were not friendly to memory. Whales present an even more striking case. In the layers where they first appear, they are already well on their way toward becoming marine specialists. Their hind limbs are shrinking, their bodies are elongating, their ears show adaptations for underwater hearing. But the earlier stages of this transformation, when their ancestors walked fully on land, are scarce in many parts of the world. Some of the finest transitional fossils come from a narrow region along the ancient Tethys shoreline, suggesting that outside this corridor, the conditions required to preserve bone were simply absent. The gaps do not reflect the absence of ancestors, but the absence of the right circumstances for sediment to hold them. Bats add yet another layer of silence. Their first fossils show fully developed wings with elongated fingers supporting thin membranes. Their skulls are already adapted for echolocation, or at least for acute hearing. Yet the transitional forms between walking mammals and flying hunters remain elusive. The bones required for flight are so thin that they break easily and fossilise poorly. Many early bats likely lived in forested environments where acidic soils dissolve bone quickly. The result is a lineage that appears suddenly, not because evolution leapt, but because the fossil record could not grasp the fragile intermediates. Even primate origins are full of missing intervals. Genetic evidence places the divergence of major primate groups far earlier than the fossils suggest. The small creatures that would eventually give rise to lemurs, monkeys, apes and humans likely lived in warm, humid environments that left almost no trace. Fossils appear in bursts, often separated by millions of years of sedimentary silence. These pauses do not reflect an absence of life, but an absence of preservation. When paleontologists map these gaps across regions, they often find that entire epochs of tropical forest evolution are missing. Woodlands decay quickly, soil churns, bones vanish. The ancestors of our species moved through landscapes that kept their secrets well. Large mammals of the Paleocene and Eocene periods tell a similar story. Many groups radiated rapidly after the extinction of the dinosaurs, occupying niches left vacant in the aftermath. Yet the transitional forms leading into these radiations are frequently missing. Some species appear in the fossil record with distinctive traits already established: specialized teeth, elongated limbs, or unique skeletal adaptations. When sediments from earlier periods are examined, researchers often find that the land experienced erosion rather than deposition during key intervals. Instead of layering new sediments that could trap bones, rivers cut downward, carrying remains away before they could fossilize. The result is an illusion of sudden appearance. These patterns across geological time remind us that the fossil record is not a complete archive. It is an uneven wilderness of sediment, shaped by chance, environment, and the fragile chemistry of preservation. For every fossil found in stone, countless others were lost long before they had any chance of surviving. Evolution unfolds continuously, but the Earth captures only fragments of its progress. We walk through museums filled with remarkable specimens, yet each one is a survivor of improbable circumstances. The ancestors that link them often lived in places beyond the reach of rock. The more we study these gaps, the more we realize how little the record can tell us about the fine-grained details of life's unfolding. We see the results of ancient transformations without seeing the steps. We infer relationships from shared structures, from genetic similarity, from rare transitional fossils that offer brief glimpses into the story's quieter passages. But the full continuity remains hidden. We do not know for certain how quickly some of these changes occurred. We only know that geological time is full of places where the Earth itself was not collecting memories. The living world is shaped as much by what it failed to preserve as by what it left behind. In the sedimentary archives of deep time, silence is not an absence of life, but an absence of the conditions required for life to leave a trace. These gaps are not failures of evolution, but failures of preservation, and in their presence we learn to read the fossil record not as a flawless record, but as a partial story written across stone. And what Earth forgets in sediment, it sometimes forgets in climate. What if I told you that some of the most dramatic climate shifts in Earth's recent past happened so quickly that the planet itself barely had time to record them? Picture a world at the end of the last ice age, when meltwater carved new rivers across continents, animals expanded into freshly thawed valleys, and humans followed routes that had been sealed in ice for thousands of years. The environments they walked through were not stable backdrops, but moving targets, reshaping themselves over spans short enough to be felt within a single lifetime. And yet, when we search for evidence of those moments today, the geological record falls strangely quiet. Sediments that should have captured changing lakes, shifting forests and collapsing glaciers are thin, interrupted or missing entirely. It is as if climate outran the Earth's ability to keep notes, leaving only hints in places where we would expect entire chapters. Paleoclimate scientists first recognised this pattern when they examined ice cores from Greenland, each layer holding a frozen echo of ancient temperatures and atmospheric conditions. What they found was astonishing. At the onset of the Younger Dryas period, roughly 12,900 years ago, temperatures in parts of the northern hemisphere appear to have plunged in a matter of decades, not centuries, decades. That speed is nearly unimaginable when we think about glacial worlds. Climate had always been portrayed as a slow-moving force, shifting over millennia as ice advanced or retreated, but the layers of trapped gas and dust told a different story. The transition into this sudden cold event was so abrupt that the markers in the ice appear almost compressed, like a book whose binding has been pulled too tight. We do not know for certain what caused such a dramatic swing. Hypotheses include meltwater pulses altering ocean circulation and changes in atmospheric patterns triggered by ice sheet collapse. But whatever the mechanism, the pace of change was faster than many ecosystems could respond to. Sediments from ancient lakes offer another kind of silence. Many lakes that existed during the late Pleistocene period show layers documenting centuries of calm water, abundant algae, and stable shorelines. Then, suddenly, the record becomes patchy. In some cores, entire intervals expected to contain clay, silt, or organic material are replaced by coarse sand or nothing at all. Researchers studying these sequences suggest that rapid drops in lake levels exposed shorelines to erosion, removing sediments before they could build up. In other cases, windblown dust blanketed the lake surfaces, slowing biological activity. The result is an incomplete archive, where the very periods of greatest environmental turmoil are the ones least represented in the layers beneath our feet. The dust itself holds clues. During abrupt climate transitions, atmospheric circulation intensified, lifting fine particles from dry steppes and depositing them across vast distances. These dust layers often mask botanical and faunal traces, creating thick bands of uniform colour that carry little detailed information about the ecosystems they covered. When paleobotanists analyse pollen trapped in these layers, they often find only the hardiest, most wind-dispersed species represented. Plants sensitive to moisture or temperature, the ones that would tell us how landscapes shifted during rapid changes, are either absent or so rare that no confident picture can be drawn. It is a reminder that preservation is selective. The climate that moved quickly enough to reshape continents also moved quickly enough to erase much of its own evidence. Even regions far from the great ice sheets show signs of environmental turbulence that the geological record struggles to capture. In parts of Africa, lake sediments reveal periods when water levels rose and fell with surprising speed, altering vegetation zones and wildlife distributions. At certain sites, thin layers of volcanic ash or river-deposited sand mark intervals where usual sedimentation failed. The soil turned over too rapidly for delicate traces to settle. Charcoal fragments suggest wildfires became more frequent during these transitional phases, further disrupting the formation of stable sedimentary records. In some places, the only indication that climate shifted at all is a change in the type of mineral deposited, a small geochemical whisper where we would expect a detailed environmental story. When we look at these gaps collectively, a pattern emerges. Climate during the late Pleistocene period was not a gentle curve but a series of pulses. Short, sharp, unpredictable pulses. Ecosystems reorganized as forests retreated or advanced. Coastlines shifted, and rivers changed course. Human communities adjusted as well, moving across landscapes that transformed within the span of a generation. But because these changes happened so quickly, the sediments that might have preserved their traces often did not form. A lake that dried out in a decade could not build the thick, continuous layers we rely on. A forest that shifted its range rapidly might leave only scattered pollen grains. A river that flooded, then narrowed, then flooded again would carry away as much as it deposited. We do not know precisely how people living through these transitions perceived them. No written accounts survive from that time, and oral traditions, where they remain, are difficult to tie definitively to specific climatic events. Yet archaeological evidence suggests that populations migrated, hunting patterns changed, and tools adapted to new environments. These behavioural shifts are visible at certain sites, but often the layers associated with the most dramatic environmental changes are disturbed or thin. The archaeological record suffers the same problem as the geological one. When climate moves too quickly, the ground beneath us leaves only partial testimony. This is why studying ancient climate often feels like listening to a story told with missing sentences. We know the characters, we know the general plot, but the pace at which events unfolded is captured only in the briefest of notes. Scientists reconstruct what they can from ice, sediment, pollen, and isotope signatures, piecing together a timeline that is both remarkable in its detail and humbling in its limitations. The most transformative periods are quite often those the Earth could not record cleanly. Climate sometimes moved in pulses too swift for memory, human or geological, to follow. And when environments shift quickly, human traces slip with them. Preserved stalagmites that grew during stable climatic periods and abruptly stopped when temperatures or moisture levels shifted too quickly. These calcium archives act like slow-growing diaries, adding thin layers each year. Yet during the most intense climate pulses, their growth bands become distorted or vanish entirely. Researchers analysing these formations have found sudden reductions in trace elements that track rainfall and evaporation, suggesting that entire weather regimes flipped within spans shorter than a human childhood. In some caves, a single sharp transition is sandwiched between centuries of more predictable change. These interruptions remind us that even stone records can falter when the world shifts faster than the chemistry that writes them. Offshore sediments offer similar glimpses into climate's erratic rhythm. Marine cores from the North Atlantic contain layers thick with tiny shells of planktonic organisms that thrived in warm waters. Then, without transitional forms, a colder species dominates the next layer. The shift is sometimes so abrupt that the microfossils appear almost stacked, warm species below and cold species above, with no indication of gradual adjustment. Oceanographers studying these layers interpret them as markers of rapid changes in ocean circulation, possibly reshaping currents over a few decades. The oceans too struggled to preserve the evidence of their own transformation, as strong storms and shifting currents stirred sediments before they could settle into orderly layers. Even the soils beneath grasslands record climate instability through their isotopic signatures. In some regions, carbon isotopes in ancient soil profiles switch quickly between values associated with cool season plants and those tied to warm season grasses. These abrupt changes suggest that vegetation communities reorganized at speeds that defy slow ecological succession. The absence of intermediate signatures implies that once certain climatic thresholds were crossed, entire plant communities retreated or advanced almost at once, leaving behind soils that jump between states rather than blending them. The earth beneath open plains carries traces of these shifts, but the transitions themselves are stored only in the chemical residue, not in gradual layers. Archaeologists studying human migrations in these periods face similar challenges. Stone tools, hearth remains, and animal bones sometimes appear in sequences that skip entire ecological phases, as if people arrived in a landscape that had already transformed or departed just before the next shift occurred. At other sites, cultural materials are pulled out of their original context by flooding rivers or wind-blown dunes, complicating attempts to tie human activity to specific climate events. The result is a fragmented record of motion driven by environmental uncertainty, where humans moved in step with changes that the ground barely managed to record. Across all these systems, ice, water, stone, soil, and the traces of human movement, the same lesson repeats itself with quiet insistence. Rapid climate change leaves behind uneven memory. The intervals most critical for understanding how species, ecosystems, and people adapted are often those least preserved. What remains is an outline with missing lines, a story whose turning points are marked not by layers rich in detail, but by silence where detail should be. A shoreline at the end of the last glacial period, quiet and wind-softened, with waves touching land that no longer exists today. A small group of humans walks along this forgotten coast, carrying baskets woven from reeds, tools shaped from bone, and stories held entirely in their memories. They leave footprints in wet sand, a cooking fire that burns low, a handful of shells shaped into ornaments. And then the sea rises, slowly at first, then faster as the ice sheets soften under a warming world. The tide comes in. The archaeological record disappears. What remains is not a camp or a tool or a shelter, but the humbling realization that some human histories were washed away before we ever learned how to look for them. This is the quiet reality behind some of the most perplexing gaps in our past. Entire populations appearing and vanishing across continents with almost no archaeological continuity, as if they slip through the cracks in time itself. We do not know for certain how many human migrations followed paths that could never archive their passing. Yet the evidence we do have suggests that many of the earliest movements took place in ecological corridors that simply do not preserve material culture well. When paleoanthropologists map the spread of early Homo sapiens or the later expansions of Holocene communities, they often find patterns in the distribution of sites that resemble constellations rather than lines. A bright cluster along a river or in a cave appears isolated, with no trail behind it and no gradual movement ahead of it. The temptation is to assume missing people, missing cultures, missing chapters of our shared story. But another interpretation is more grounded and far more sobering. These people were not missing. The environments they moved through were never built to hold their memory. Consider the earliest coastal migrations, the ones that carried humans along the edges of continents during the late Pleistocene. Sea levels were more than 100 meters lower than today, exposing vast coastal plains rich in fish, shellfish, and edible plants. These shorelines were perfect pathways for mobile foragers, allowing them to travel long distances with minimal risk. But when the Great Melt began around 12,000 years ago, those ancient coastlines drowned. Campsites that once sat on high bluffs now rest beneath the continental shelf, sealed under layers of sediment. We know this not from the sites themselves, which are mostly inaccessible, but from the pattern of later settlements that appear suddenly inland, as though people emerged from nowhere. The truth is simpler. Their earlier history lies underwater, erased by a change in sea level that occurred over just a few hundred human generations. Upland corridors tell a similar story. These were the high ridges and interior plateaus where early hunter-gatherers travelled lightly, carrying tents made from hide and poles cut from nearby trees. These shelters were not meant to survive beyond their use. They left almost nothing in the soil. Seasonal camps disappeared beneath vegetation and rainfall, dissolving into natural layers indistinguishable from ordinary forest litter. Even stone tools sometimes eroded, or were buried in sediment transported downslope by storms. Archaeologists often find a single chipped core or a broken blade on a mountain top, and face a silence stretching for thousands of years around it. Such finds suggest motion rather than settlement, a path taken, a moment paused, nothing more. It is the same with wetland migrations. Marshes and river deltas tend to archive pollen, seeds and sediments exceptionally well, but they are poor keepers of human artifacts. Organic materials decay quickly. Tents collapse inward and sink into mud. Canoes rot. Clothing dissolves. Only the occasional fishing weight or shaped stone survives, and even then, it may be carried by water far from where it was used. When people lived in these environments, they relied on materials that were convenient, abundant, and unfortunately temporary. Their own ingenuity ensured that their material culture was biodegradable long before biodegradable was a word. What remains is a gap that is not a mystery of disappearance, but a confirmation of mobility. The deeper question is how we know these movements occurred at all. In many regions, the archaeological silence is answered by genetics. Ancient DNA reveals population turnovers and expansions that archaeology alone could never have traced. In some parts of Eurasia, for example, skeletons only a few hundred years apart show profound genetic differences, even when the archaeological remains around them look nearly identical. In other regions, isolated genetic markers link people separated by thousands of kilometres with no artefacts connecting them. The evidence suggests that groups moved through landscapes without leaving durable traces, passing across plains, coasts, forests and valleys like a shadow crossing a wall. It helps to imagine how much of our own lives would vanish if time worked on us as it worked on the Pleistocene. A modern campsite might include plastic, metal and glass, but remove those industrial materials and replace them with wood, hide and fibre, and the memory collapses. Within a decade, the campsite becomes a clearing. Within a century, it becomes forest. Within 1,000 years, it becomes soil. Most human history took place in these kinds of settings. People carried their culture in their bodies and voices, not in the objects they left behind. Even the tools that should have survived often travelled with them. A finely made spear point might be used for decades, passed from parent to child, sharpened repeatedly, and eventually discarded far from the region where it was first shaped. The archaeological record sometimes gives the illusion that innovations spread rapidly, almost overnight, across enormous distances. But we do not know if the tools moved or the people moved. The landscape holds the same silence either way. Some researchers focus on perishable technologies as the key to understanding these gaps. Basketry, weaving, wooden architecture and boneworking were central to many ancient societies, yet almost none of these elements survive except in the rarest of conditions. The absence of evidence tells us little about their presence. Even in places where stone tools are abundant, they may represent only a small fraction of daily life. If 80% of a toolkit was made of organic materials, then 80% of that culture is gone by default. The irony is that mobility itself, which allows populations to thrive in changing environments, also ensures that their archaeological signatures remain faint. Highly mobile groups do not build permanent structures. They do not leave refuse piles large enough to endure. They do not create layers of sediment that can be easily distinguished from natural processes. Their lives unfolded in landscapes meant for renewal, not preservation, and so the record renews itself by erasing them. There is also a quiet humanity in this realization. These were not forgotten peoples. They were not erased by catastrophe or conflict. They simply lived in ways that did not require permanent marks. Their stories endured in oral traditions that have long since faded. Their memory persists in the genetic threads carried unknowingly by distant descendants. They were part of a world that valued movement over permanence, adaptation over accumulation, belonging to the land rather than inscribing themselves onto it. And this may be the most humbling part of all. The archaeological gaps do not reveal how little they left behind, but how much they carried forward. They were the ones who crossed continents, survived climate change, adapted to new ecologies, and passed down the knowledge of how to live lightly on a restless planet. What the soil does not remember, our species still embodies in its deep resilience. And the more mobile the people, the more fragile the traces. Sometimes the evidence of movement appears not in grand gestures, but in the smallest anomalies. A shard of obsidian discovered hundreds of kilometres from the nearest volcanic source, a marine shell buried deep inland where no sea has been for tens of thousands of years, a peculiar form of flint napping that appears abruptly in a region, then fades just as quickly. Each of these is a quiet fingerprint, the remnant of people who left almost nothing else behind. Archaeologists call these objects out-of-place artifacts, not because they were mysterious or impossible, but because they hint at travel routes and social exchanges far broader than the surviving material culture would suggest. They are, in a sense, the crumbs left behind by migrations too light to cast shadows. Another insight comes from examining how landscapes themselves shift across centuries. A trail worn into the earth by repeated human passage might last for generations, but if a floodplain changes its course or a forest reclaims the ground, the path dissolves like breath on cold glass. We know of ancient trackways preserved only when extraordinary circumstances intervened. Peat bogs, dry caves, volcanic ash. Outside of these rare environments, ordinary footpaths, the arteries of early mobility, vanish within a season or two. This means that most movement, even when substantial, leaves no lines on the landscape for us to follow. It is also important to consider how social structures influence what gets left behind. Not all societies valued accumulation. Some operated within traditions that emphasized portability, sharing, or ritual destruction. In such cultures, objects were not meant to endure. A tool might be intentionally broken and returned to the earth after a hunt. A woven garment might be burned rather than discarded. A shelter might be dismantled so fully that no trace remains. Archaeology is shaped not only by what time destroys, but by what people chose not to preserve. In the Arctic, for example, some Inuit groups practiced a form of seasonal mobility that left barely any archaeological footprint at all. They used snow architecture, temporary meat caches, and tools crafted from bone and sinew. What little survives often appears as faint discolorations in the soil or as a scattering of bones transported by animals. To reconstruct these lifeways, researchers rely on ethno-historical records and oral traditions more than on objects. When we project those insights backward into deep time, we are reminded that countless earlier groups may have lived in similarly ephemeral ways, leaving behind only the subtlest shadows. Genetic evidence, for all its clarity, also carries its own ambiguities. A mitochondrial lineage might show continuity across a region for 10,000 years, but without material culture to anchor that lineage to specific migrations, we cannot easily determine how people moved within that span. Did they expand slowly through valleys? Did they leapfrog across familiar territories during climate shifts? Were they driven by drought, opportunity, or conflict? DNA tells us that movement happened. Archaeology struggles to tell us why or how. Even river systems complicate the story. Many of the world's ancient highways were not on land but on water. People navigated estuaries, lakes, braided channels and deltas that have since changed course. A site that once stood at a strategic confluence may now lie beneath agricultural fields or kilometres away from the nearest water source. Without the river's former shape, the logic of these settlements becomes harder to read. What we interpret as isolated sites may once have been vibrant nodes in seasonal networks, whose connective tissue was water now lost to time. And beyond all this lies the simplest truth. Mobility is the default human state. Sedentism is the anomaly. For most of our species' existence, we moved in cycles shaped by animals, rivers, seasons, and stories. Permanence was rare. Home was layered, not fixed. And in that mobility, the record thins. The soil remembers houses. It struggles to remember journeys. And the more mobile the people, the more fragile the traces. A civilization rises in the warmth of a river valley or the shade of a forest canopy. Its people shaping wood, weaving reeds, carving soil and stretching textiles across frames. Homes breathe with the seasons, walls shift with humidity, and the imprint of each generation blends into the land almost as soon as it is made. And now imagine returning thousands of years later, searching for the traces of that world, only to find a silence so complete that it feels as though no one ever lived there at all. This is the paradox at the heart of many ancient societies. They were large, sophisticated, interconnected, yet they entrusted their stories to materials the earth could not keep. Archaeologists have long known that the durability of a civilization's material culture is not a measure of its complexity, but of the environment in which it lived. Some of the most politically intricate societies developed in settings where wood rots within seasons, soils dissolve bone, and monsoons resculpt the ground with each passing year. We do not know for certain how many cities once stood on these shifting landscapes, but the evidence suggests that entire cultural spheres flourished in the gaps where preservation was almost impossible. This is not a failure of these societies, it is simply the quiet physics of decay against time. It explains why stone-walled kingdoms echo loudly across history, while their wooden contemporaries remain shadows at the edge of archaeology. Across vast stretches of sub-Saharan Africa, for example, early kingdoms grew by shaping their environments in ways unfriendly to future archaeology. Regions rich in timber and seasonally fluctuating soils encouraged architecture made primarily of wood and earth. Excavations repeatedly showed deep post holes where grand halls once stood, outlines of palisades that enclosed ceremonial centres, and faint stains marking ancient hearths. The people who built these worlds relied on materials ideally suited for rapid construction and daily life, but poorly suited for geological longevity. Written documents were often composed on perishable media or transmitted orally, leaving later historians dependent on fragments of pottery, metalworking debris, and distributions of imported goods to understand networks of power and trade. What we know is only a fraction of what was once present. In the Pacific, seafaring societies carried their knowledge not in stone, but across water. Their canoes were carved with precision and maintained through inherited craftsmanship. Yet these crafts leave almost no trace in archaeological layers, because they were built to move and to weather the sea, not to endure burial. Many island homesteads were built from timber and pandanus, structures tied to cycles of wind and rainfall. When abandoned, they returned quickly to the earth, becoming nutrient for new vegetation. We find stone foundations from some periods, but for the majority of early habitation, only scattered remnants of shell tools, hearth ash, and botanical residues allow us to piece together daily life. The impression left is of societies defined by ecology rather than architecture, a reminder that permanence is not a universal human value. Dense tropical environments present their own challenges, particularly regions where soils are acidic and biological activity is constant. In such ecosystems, bone and wood break down rapidly. Early civilizations in areas of Southeast Asia, Central Africa, and parts of the Amazon basin relied on woven textiles, palm leaf materials, shaped vines, and architectural frameworks of bamboo. These materials served their purpose beautifully in living societies, but left almost nothing behind for future archaeologists. We do not know for certain how many settlements existed within these forests, but surveys using LiDAR and remote sensing have revealed landscapes once thought empty to be rich with geometric earthworks, roads, canals, and settlement mounds. These findings suggest that the absence of durable materials hid entire cultural worlds from view, worlds that were only rediscovered when technology allowed us to see beneath the canopy. North America's mound-building cultures remind us that even when earthworks survive, the built environment around them may be lost. Many monumental mounds still rise from plains and river valleys, shaped by generations of labour, yet the structures that once stood atop them were made of wood, bark, and thatch. These were administrative centres, residences of leaders, ceremonial enclosures, storehouses, and meeting halls, but they decayed quickly once abandoned. What remains are geometric forms and layers of soil containing traces of pottery, beads, copper artefacts, and burnt residues. Archaeologists map these features carefully, reconstructing how communities organize themselves, but the lived environment that tied these elements together is glimpsed only through indirect evidence. The persistence of the mounds is a testament to intentional engineering, but it also highlights how vulnerable the rest of the settlement fabric was to time and climate. In Southeast Asia, monsoon-driven erosion reshapes the landscape with every season. Civilizations there often built structures from a blend of earth, bamboo, and light timber, adapting to an environment where flexibility and breathability mattered more than durability. Torrential rains wash away surface layers, redistribute soil, and transform once stable ground into shifting terrain. Over centuries, this erasure has been so thorough that some early policies are known primarily through inscriptions transported far from their original centres, or through metal objects found without architectural context. Even the earthwork remnants that survive are often heavily altered, making reconstruction difficult. Scholars approach these sites with humility, acknowledging that the clay tablets, palm leaf manuscripts, wooden shrines, and domestic centres of these societies are almost entirely lost. It is tempting to imagine that the absence of evidence reflects the absence of complexity, but the persistence of trade artefacts, linguistic patterns, and oral histories suggest otherwise. In many regions, what remains today are the durable residues of sophisticated exchange networks, beads made from distant shells, iron or bronze tools crafted with skilled metallurgy, or imported ceramics that hint at far-reaching interactions. These objects offer glimpses into societies that did not need stone palaces to administer governance, or stone temples to practice belief. Their sophistication lay not in building to endure geological time, but in building to meet the immediate needs of living communities. And so the archaeological record tilts heavily toward the durable and the inorganic. Civilizations that preferred organic materials appear faintly, not because they lacked complexity or longevity, but because their entire world was designed to align with the living cycles, Their homes decomposed, their writing dissolved, their pathways grew over, the earth reclaimed almost everything they made. We arrive too late and see only the residue, a shard here, a hearth stain there, a post-hole alignment that once held a great hall. It is a quiet reminder that absence is not emptiness. It is simply what happens when life returns too quickly to the places where people once stood. Some of the largest human populations in prehistory may belong to this category. Societies that thrived by adapting to warm, wet, and ever-changing ecosystems. Without stone or fired brick, they left only scant impressions on soil chemistry, geological layers, and scattered artifacts. When archaeologists do uncover signs of their presence, the scale inferred from these fragments often far exceeds the material that remains. This pattern tells us something important. The physical archive of humanity is governed more by environment than by ambition. Our search is therefore always partial, always shaped by the biases of preservation. The cultures that lived closest to the rhythms of their landscapes remain the hardest to find. Yet there is a certain humility in this realization. It reminds us that the texture of the past cannot be judged by what survives. History is not the story of stone, it is the story of people, and people have always belonged more to the living world than to the geological one. The societies built from reeds, bark, bamboo, grass, hides, and woven fibre were no less complex than those of marble and granite. They simply trusted the present moment more than the permanence of record. If we follow this thread even further, we begin to see how many societies made deliberate choices that favoured adaptability over durability. In some regions, the decision to build lightly was not simply ecological, but philosophical. Communities shaped by seasonal movement often viewed permanence as a burden. Their cities breathed, shifting in size or location according to rainfall, herds, soil fertility, or ritual calendars. Archaeology struggles to capture such flexibility because it leaves no layered floors of occupation, no repeated rebuilding, no thick refuse deposits. Instead, the same campsite may have been used briefly every generation, leaving only faint traces across the broader landscape. Where more rooted civilizations left ruins that rise out of the ground, these societies left landscapes that carry only a subtle change in plant chemistry or soil compaction. To read these traces requires a different kind of vision, one less concerned with stone walls and more attentive to the quiet ecological footprints of human presence. Even when these communities grew large, their architectural choices remained guided by the materials around them. Timber-rich regions produced enormous halls supported by carved posts wider than a person's embrace, yet the wood deteriorated within decades if unmaintained. The arrival of termites or a shift in humidity could undo a generation's work. Oral histories from various cultures describe buildings that were rebuilt regularly, not because of collapse, but because renewal itself was meaningful, a way of allowing structures to age alongside the people who lived within them. For archaeologists, this means encountering buildings that were renewed in place, leaving layered post holes whose precise sequence is nearly impossible to untangle. What looks like a single generation of construction may hide the work of centuries, all erased by the degradable nature of the materials. In settings with heavy rainfall or dramatic seasonal cycles, whole neighbourhoods could vanish between one excavation season and the next. Floodplains were especially challenging. Many societies built directly on alluvial soils because those lands were rich and centrally located. Yet floodwaters redistributed sediments unpredictably. Entire settlements were buried beneath silt or carried away in storm surges. Centuries later, the surviving evidence may be a patchwork of dispersed ceramics, scattered hearths, or patches of altered soil chemistry. Reconstructing such worlds is slow and patient work. archaeologists sift through sediments that have been churned repeatedly, knowing that each fragment represents a moment that survived erosion by chance rather than design. Large-scale landscape engineering also complicates interpretation. Earthwork terraces, irrigation ditches and field systems often outlast the wooden structures they supported, yet these features rarely contain datable artifacts or clear indicators of who built them. Without associated architecture or writing, scholars must rely on comparative soil studies, pollen data, and regional settlement patterns to infer chronology. It is a method that demands caution and humility, because the earthworks may reflect generations of use by different cultural groups. The past is layered not only in soil, but in human succession across the same terrain, and so we are left with civilizations that feel both vast and intimate. Vast in the scale of their landscapes, intimate in the fragility of their traces. They remind us that permanence is not the default trajectory of human achievement. Many societies measured their success not in monuments that would last for millennia, but in the resilience of seasonal rhythms, the strength of exchange networks, and the continuity of the knowledge transmitted through hands and memory rather than stone and script. When those societies faltered or moved on, the land reclaimed their spaces with astonishing speed. To walk through these once inhabited regions today is to feel the gentle weight of stories that were not meant to be written in rock. Yet even when structures endure, memory can fail in other ways. A community sits around its hearths in the last years before a great unravelling. Children watch their elders carve symbols into clay or ink wooden tablets with practised confidence, believing that these signs will outlive them. Scribes walk between households carrying boards marked with characters no one outside their valley has ever seen, and then imagine returning only 2 or 3 generations later. The population has shifted, the city has thinned, and the people who once knew how the signs were spoken or sung have disappeared. What remains are marks whose meanings died not because they were unimportant, but because the chain of memory holding them together snapped too quickly. This is the quiet tragedy of fragile scripts. They vanish at the speed that human continuity breaks. We do not know for certain how many early writing traditions vanished in this way, but the evidence suggests that more scripts have been lost than preserved. Everywhere archaeologists uncover proto-writing or early sign systems, we also find signs of abrupt cultural change. These scripts were built on more than marks. They required steady generational teaching, shared pronunciation, and a consistent context of use. Without those conditions, a writing system becomes a collection of shapes separated from sound, drifting away from the world that once gave them meaning. The collapse of communities does not simply remove scribes. It removes the entire framework that allowed their scripts to function. Some systems died within a single generation. Others lingered in the hands of a shrinking elite before fading quietly into the archaeological record. The most famous example is the script of the Indus Valley, a civilization that thrived across broad regions during the 3rd millennium before the Common Era. Their seals carry an array of signs arranged with striking regularity. Some researchers see patterns consistent with linguistic structure. Others argue for a non-linguistic but still codified tradition. What makes the Indus script so haunting is not its undeciphered nature, but the abruptness with which it disappeared. As urban centres declined and settlement patterns changed, the artisans who engraved these signs seem to have vanished along with the administrative systems that enabled them. No transitional script appears afterward. No bilingual inscription helps bridge the gulf. The script simply stops. What remains is a language we can touch but cannot hear. In Anatolia, a different story unfolded. Local hieroglyphs known as Luwian signs were used by ruling courts during the late Bronze Age. yet their use was restricted to elite circles, encoded in monumental contexts or administrative seals. When political turmoil swept across the region during the 12th century before the Common Era, the scribble schools that taught these signs collapsed. Without broader public use, without widespread literacy to keep the script alive, it faded rapidly. Later cultures preserved fragments of the symbols, but the living chain of instruction was broken. Decipherment only became possible in the modern era through painstaking cross-comparisons with better preserved related languages. It is a rare case where a script died but left just enough context to be revived. More elusive still is Linear A, the script of Bronze Age Crete. It appears on tablets, libation vessels and religious objects, suggesting both administrative and ceremonial use, yet the language underlying it remains unknown. When Mycenaean Greeks later arrived and adapted the script into Linear B, they imposed their own phonetic values on the signs, leaving no direct continuity with the earlier system. Linear A does not reappear in any later form. Its symbols survive physically, but their spoken meanings died in the centuries following Crete's palatial transitions. It is an example of how even literate societies can lose entire corpuses of knowledge when political or demographic shifts disrupt the fragile chain of scribal training. Far across the Pacific on Rapa Nui, a script known as Rongorongo offers another example of abrupt silencing. Carved into wooden tablets that survived only by chance, its signs are arranged in a unique reverse Boustrophedon pattern. Ethnographic accounts from the 19th century describe its use, yet by that time the population had endured extreme demographic pressures, including enslavement raids and ecological collapse. The people capable of reading Rongorongo were likely few, and the tradition may have already been fading. When scholars later attempted to recover the system, there were no living informants able to explain its grammar or purpose. The script had died too quickly, leaving behind an archive that modern scholarship still struggles to interpret. Even earlier protoscripts reveal how fragile written communication can be. In several regions, including parts of southeastern Europe and ancient China, archaeologists have found signs carved into bone, ceramic or stone that hint at symbolic tradition, but resist linguistic classification. These protoscripts might have represented inventories, ritual objects, or clan markers, yet without continuity or living descendants, their meaning is unanchored. They sit at the threshold between art and writing, a reminder that the invention of script is not a singular leap, but a spectrum of experimentation. When communities dissolved or shifted, these early systems often evaporated without leaving later descendants. But perhaps the most humbling aspect of script loss is the speed with which it can happen. A writing system depends on more than symbols. It relies on teachers who remember the rules, students who practice them, and a community that trusts the script enough to use it widely. The moment the network weakens, the script becomes vulnerable. If disaster strikes or population shrinks, the imbalance can be irreversible. A single lost generation may be enough to end a tradition centuries in the making. Linguists often describe this as a break in transmission, but the phrase hardly conveys the depth of what is lost. When a script disappears, it is not merely a set of signs that vanish. An entire worldview becomes inaccessible, its metaphors and rhythms impossible to reconstruct. There is a human tenderness in this realization. Scripts die not because they failed, but because the communities who carried them lived through storms too great for continuity. These scripts represent the ambitions of people who believed their signs would bridge generations, and yet they proved vulnerable to the fragility of human survival itself. Each undeciphered board, each mysterious seal impression, each carved line that no one today can read, is a trace of a conversation that once threaded through daily life and ceremony. It is the archaeological equivalent of hearing only the echo of a voice and knowing that the speaker is long gone. Yet their loss teaches us something about the relationship between writing and memory. A script is only as durable as its readers. Stone inscriptions can endure for millennia, but without living communities to interpret them, they become puzzles rather than messages. As we excavate these lost scripts, we approach them with humility, aware that we are touching the outer surface of traditions shaped by minds we cannot fully reconstruct. The silence they leave behind is not empty. It is filled with the shape of untranslatable meaning, and when writing is lost, history fractures, but belief persists. A story told beside a fire thousands of years ago, its words softened by smoke and sleep, its images drifting between memory and metaphor. The people who told it had no libraries, no archives, no carved tablets. What they had was the sky, the sea, the land beneath their feet, and the insistence that something profound had once happened here. They could not preserve their homes against rising water, or keep their settlements safe from shifting climates, but they could preserve a story, and somehow the story endured while the buildings, bones and pottery decayed away. When we listen to the oldest myths, we're not searching for literal truth. We're trying to understand what human beings chose to carry when everything else could be lost. Picture a world at the end of the last glacial age when the oceans were still hundreds of feet lower and the shoreline stretched far into what is now open water. Across every inhabited continent, people lived on these vanished coasts, building homes and gathering food along landscapes we can no longer excavate. When the seas rose across generations, entire worlds drowned quietly. Archaeology cannot reach most of those drowned plains. The sediment atop them is too thick, the access too limited, the clues dissolved beyond recognition. Yet in the myths passed down by their descendants, the memory of water rising appears again and again. We do not base geological models on myth, but we cannot ignore the consistency of these stories, scattered across thousands of miles and thousands of years. Take the flood narratives. Nearly every early culture has one, but what makes them remarkable is not their shared presence. It is their shared detail. Many describe land vanishing, shorelines moving inland, and peoples relocating to higher ground during a time when the sea did not retreat again. Paleogeographic reconstructions based on coral terraces and submerged river channels show that between approximately 14,000 and 8,000 years ago, the oceans rose in abrupt pulses. Some of these pulses were intense enough to redraw entire coastlines within a human lifetime. The archaeological record at those depths is gone, but the stories remain. They linger in the form of ancestors calling back to a world swallowed by water. These are memories spoken long after the evidence slipped beneath the waves. Or consider the oral histories of indigenous groups in Australia describing great coastal plains where people once hunted and travelled. For decades, researchers assumed these to be mythic landscapes. Yet paleogeographic mapping of the Sahul Shelf has revealed submerged river systems and estuaries matching the descriptions. These memories were preserved for thousands of years without written language. The stories survive even as their archaeological counterparts rest beneath layers of silt. We cannot verify every detail, but the correspondences invite us to treat ancient stories with a quiet respect. They may not tell us exactly what happened, but they tell us what mattered to the people who lived through those changes. Some myths speak not of landscapes, but of lineages. In certain regions of Africa and the Pacific, genealogies include pauses, compressions, or abrupt shifts in ancestry that appear unusual at first glance. Linguistic analysis suggests that these breaks may align with real, demographic bottlenecks detected through genetic data. Where archaeology sees only a silence, a period without pottery, tools, or settlement traces, the oral traditions remember that something broke the line of descent. Some genealogical stories describe an ancestral generation that survived a catastrophic event, or an era when only a handful of families remained. These do not prove any specific historical population collapse, but they echo patterns scholars can identify through entirely different kinds of evidence. Myth becomes a whispered memory of things that left no pottery to read and no stone foundations to uncover. Other stories call attention to fire and ash. Across the Mediterranean, Pacific, and parts of Southeast Asia, myths describe mountains that exploded without warning, darkening the sky and changing the world. These narratives often center on famine, migration, or the need to appease an angry sky. For a long time, these stories were interpreted purely as symbolic, until paleoclimate and geological work began identifying major volcanic events that correspond to the approximate timelines of some of these tales. The eruption of the volcano now known as Santorini left traces in ice cores, marine sediments, and distant tree rings. But in the lands immediately affected, much of the archaeological context was destroyed. A story survived instead, carried forward in a cultural memory that refused to vanish. Even the sky itself carries myths that reflect real phenomena. Meteor events chronicled as dragons or blazing spirits sometimes align with known atmospheric anomalies. Chinese court records contain descriptions of comets and fireballs, but older mythic traditions in the same regions speak of burning skies or stars falling in ways that match what astronomers now identify as genuine meteor storms. These stories are not written with scientific precision, yet they preserve the emotional truth of having seen the sky ripple with fire. The archaeological record, which depends on what people left behind, is silent about those moments. But the stories kept something alive. What makes myth so powerful is not its accuracy, but its resilience. A pot shatters, a wooden tablet decays, a settlement sinks beneath the sea. But a story, spoken to a child who speaks it again to their own child, can survive the collapse of an entire world. We should not mistake myth for data, yet we should not dismiss it either. It's a different kind of record shaped not by sediment or climate, but by the human mind's need to understand change. Myth persists precisely where the ground provides no answers. It fills the spaces archaeology cannot reach. We do not know whether every ancient story preserves a trace of real events. Some are pure metaphor, others are cultural memory pressed into symbolic language. Some contain fragments of disasters or migrations entirely missing from the material record. What matters is that these stories exist at all. They're attempts to preserve meaning in a world that often shifted too quickly for physical continuity. When used carefully with humility and cross-disciplinary caution, myth can reveal the emotional outline of histories that left no visible layers. It reminds us that humans were witnesses to their own transformations long before we became archivists of our past. And that is perhaps the quiet power of these tales. They show us that memory is not only what survives in the ground, it is what survives in us. Sometimes the most revealing myths are not the ones describing floods or fire, but the ones explaining why people moved. Across parts of the Arctic and subarctic, for example, Inuit and Yupik oral traditions speak of entire groups leaving familiar hunting grounds because a particular animal went away. These stories name species we now know shifted their ranges dramatically during the final phases of the last glacial age. Paleozoological data confirm that caribou herds and marine mammals followed newly opening routes of ice and water, leaving some regions abruptly empty. No archaeological layer preserves the moment a community realized their food had moved hundreds of miles, yet their stories remember the emotion of following in the wake of animals that no longer returned. These migrations left few durable traces, but the stories carried the experience forward with striking clarity. In the highlands of Papua New Guinea, certain mythic sequences describe hills and valleys exhaling and changing their shape during a time when the ancestors were still moving through the landscape. For a long time, these were interpreted solely as metaphors for clan origin stories. But geomorphological studies have since revealed that parts of the highlands experienced rapid landslides and slope failures during the late Holocene, triggered by episodes of strong rainfall and tectonic shifts. Those sudden changes would have transformed rivers, paths, and fields within a single human lifetime. The land shifted in ways archaeology cannot fully reconstruct. The stories preserve how it felt to witness the Earth itself rearrange the map. Some of the most enigmatic myths come from regions where stone architecture was rare and writing absent. In southern Africa, for example, San and Co storytellers describe a time when rivers ran differently and herds moved as if guided by invisible pathways. Embedded within these narratives are subtle references to drought cycles and the expansion of grasslands during the mid-Holocene climatic optimum. Environmental proxies from lake sediments and pollen cores show that grass species composition shifted dramatically, altering animal movement and forcing human groups to adapt quickly. These ecological rearrangements left almost no archaeological footprint, yet the stories capture the sense of regions becoming unrecognizable within a few generations. There are also myths that seem to record the loss of other humans. In parts of the Pacific Northwest, oral traditions mention ancestors encountering people who lived differently, people who left no lasting communities behind. These figures appear suddenly in the stories and vanish just as quickly. Archaeology finds brief cultural horizons with distinctive tool types in the same areas, often lasting only a few centuries before disappearing. Whether those archaeological traces correspond to the people described in the stories is uncertain, but the narrative presence of lost neighbours suggests cultural encounters that left little durable material evidence. Even more delicate are the stories that align with atmospheric anomalies. Across West Africa, for instance, some myths recall a time when the sky grew dim without clouds, and the wind tasted of dust. These lines resonate with what paleoclimate cores reveal about Saharan dust transport during periods of extreme aridity. Thousands of years ago, dust storms could blanket large regions for weeks, lowering visibility and altering weather patterns. No pottery sherd or stone tool can tell us how that dimming felt, but the stories speak of a mood, a heaviness, a season when the sky became a warning. And scattered across the Andes are myths describing stars that walked across the night or returned to the horizon twice in a year. Although embellished, these narratives may echo the effects of precessional shifts or unusual heliacal risings observed by early agricultural societies. Archaeologists studying early Indian calendars have begun to suspect that some of these mythic references encode genuine astronomical observations, preserved through symbol and metaphor rather than systematic notation. Myth, at its core, is a vessel for experience. It does not archive events the way stone or bone does. It archives the meanings people drew from those events. In that sense, myth often survives precisely because it avoids detail. The details are what decay. What remains is the shape of the experience, carried in story, ritual, and fragmentary metaphor. This is why myth can hint at lost histories, even when it cannot prove them. It remembers what it felt like to endure change at scale archaeology cannot capture, preserving emotional truth long after material truth has eroded. When we read these stories with care, they become not evidence but orientation. They point toward forgotten coastlines, vanished neighbours, broken genealogies, skywide events, and landscapes that moved faster than people could settle them. They remind us that even when the ground below us is silent, human beings have always tried to leave markers in the only medium guaranteed to survive catastrophe, language shaped into story. And in this way, myth becomes a second archaeology, an excavation of memory rather than matter, uncovering the faintest outlines of worlds that left almost nothing behind. A long table lit by a single lamp in a quiet research room, a place where the night has already folded itself around the windows. A scholar sits there surrounded by data sets, stratigraphic charts, radiocarbon calibrations, microscopic sediment photographs, all of them precise and exquisitely technical. Yet the expression on their face is not confidence, but something closer to bewildered patience. They are at the frontier of what we know, trying to stitch together the history of life and humanity from fragments that often do not meet at the edges, and slowly they begin to notice a pattern. Each time a new analytical tool arrives, it does not simply clarify the record. It reveals just how much of that record has been swept away by time. This is the quiet revelation of modern science. As radiometric clocks became more accurate, extinction events once thought to span long eras now collapsed into narrower windows, forcing researchers to realize that older sequences were only approximations. As Bayesian modeling matured, some historical periods expanded while others contracted, showing intervals with almost no material culture where earlier archaeologists assumed continuous occupation. High-resolution stratigraphy, capable of isolating millimetre-thick layers, exposed microphases of construction or abandonment that contradicted entire generations of assumptions. The deeper we peer into the ground, the more we uncover the spaces where nothing remains, not because nothing happened, but because the Earth could not or did not keep it. The first wave of this realization came when extinction timelines were redated using improved radiometric techniques. Species believed to have survived long past major impact events were suddenly pulled backward in time. Their last appearance data were recalibrated to earlier centuries or earlier millennia. This shift did not simply correct the timeline, it left a gap. If these organisms vanished sooner than expected, then the ecological transitions that followed them were more abrupt than previous models allowed. Yet the layers that should capture that rapid change were thinner than a sheet of paper. Some sites revealed sediment bands representing centuries compressed into a thickness you could slide under a fingernail. Others contained nothing at all for the intervals where species replacement should have been visible. The sharper our temporal resolution became, the more startling the absence grew. Where once we thought we saw continuity, now we saw a cliff. A second wave came from demographic modelling. Populations once thought stable through particular eras were found to experience sudden constrictions, sharp troughs followed by slow recoveries that left minimal material traces. Bayesian demographic reconstructions revealed generations in which populations dropped so dramatically that the archaeological signal almost vanishes. The record of tools, structures, ornaments and refuse shrinks, not because people were absent, but because they were fewer, poorer, or more mobile. These demographic gaps became especially pronounced in regions affected by post-glacial transformations or abrupt climatic crises, where older archaeologists interpreted thin layers as simple undersampling. New statistical models pointed to entire lifeways contracting into smaller, quieter forms that left little behind. And once again, the tools meant to fill the gap instead widened it, showing that the silence was not an accident of excavation, but a genuine feature of the past. Then came the insights from Bayesian historical reconstruction, used mostly for calibrating written chronologies but increasingly applied to pre-literate sequences. Some ancient periods once considered smooth and unbroken, such as intervals in the Mediterranean, East Asia or the ancient Near East, were revealed to contain missing centuries. Places where palace archives halted abruptly were matched with modelled gaps that showed little or no human presence before new administrative systems appeared. These missing intervals did not emerge from excavators choosing the wrong trench. They emerged from mathematical treatments of all available data, showing that the apparent continuity in many historical narratives was built on assumptions rather than evidence. Some scholars describe these revisions as the ground shifting beneath the timeline, leaving depressions where historical events should be but are not. Microstratigraphy deepened the uncertainty even further. By slicing through sediment at extremely fine scales and examining the layers under high magnification, researchers discovered voids where occupation episodes should have been visible. At some sites, multiple building floors were separated by layers representing only a few seasons of human absence. At others, entire occupational horizons were missing, eroded by water or wind or eaten away by soil organisms. In high-latitude tundra sites, freeze-thaw cycles churned and blended layers, creating deceptive continuities. In tropical regions, soils rich with life consumed bone, fibre and wood faster than archaeologists could ever hope to recover them. Microstratigraphy illuminated these losses with painful clarity. No matter how careful the excavation, the thin film of surviving sediment did not reflect the fullness of what once existed. The most unsettling insights came from the most advanced recovery techniques. High-resolution imaging, chemical residue detection, and micro-artifact collection revealed stunning details. Charred seeds smaller than lentils, microscopic flakes struck from stone tools, grains of pigment used in ancient art. These methods brought intimacy to the past, showing what people cooked, how they shaped objects, where they walked inside their dwellings. But they also revealed how much had disappeared. For every charred seed preserved by a stroke of luck, thousands more had burned or rotted into nothing. For every pigment grain found beside the remnants of ancient hearths, immeasurable amounts of colour had washed into the soil or dissolved in rain. The sensitivity of these tools did not reconstruct civilizations, it demonstrated their fragility. The closer we look, the more the ground becomes a palimpsest of losses rather than a monument of preservation. Across these disciplines, a single quiet realization emerges. Our record is not a book with missing pages, but a book in which the pages were once written on materials the earth did not keep. Radiometric clocks can tighten the dates, but they cannot restore what erosion or fire removed. Population models can identify troughs, but they cannot recreate the voices of those who lived through them. Stratigraphy can reveal the thickness of time, but it cannot recover the stories that time compressed or erased. Archaeological precision is not a ladder upward into certainty. It is a lantern that illuminates how much of the path behind us has been swallowed by darkness. This does not diminish the achievements of the scholars who work tirelessly to reconstruct past ecologies, migrations, and civilizations. Instead, it highlights the humility required of anyone who studies deep time. The more refined our instruments become, the more we understand our dependence on the small fraction of evidence that survived by chance. A single bead preserved in dry sand might stand in for thousands of ornaments that turn to dust. A set of charcoal samples might represent forests whose full extent we will never map. A collapsed layer beneath a city ruin might hint at lifetimes lived in invisible structures that left no foundations at all. Aniso, the scholar at the lamplit table, returns each night not to finish the story but to acknowledge how incomplete it remains. This, quietly, is the paradox at the heart of our search for origins. Precision does not close the gaps, it reveals them. The fossil record, the archaeological record, the historical record, they are not incomplete because we have failed to dig deeply enough. They are incomplete because the planet keeps only a partial memory of its passing worlds, a memory shaped by accidents of preservation, chemistry, climate, and chance. In this sense, each discovery is a reminder that the past is larger than what remains, and the more we learn, the more the horizon of missing time expands before us, which leads to the final question: what does a gap truly mean? You are standing at the edge of a cliff at dusk, looking down at layers of stone that hold hundreds of millions of years, each one thin and fragile, each one a record we can touch with our hands. But between those layers are spaces no thicker than a whisper, places where time either passed too gently to leave a mark, or passed too violently to leave anything at all. Picture your breath drifting through the cool air as you look at those gaps and realise that they shape the meaning of everything around them. We do not climb through Earth's story as if it were a continuous staircase. We move across fragments held together by silence. And perhaps the deepest question is not how to fill that silence, but how to understand the role it plays in the story of life. The revelation, quiet but unmistakable, is that this structure repeats itself across every field that studies the past. Geologists see it in boundary layers where abrupt transitions are compressed into thin bands of iridium or ash, while the long recoveries before and after are missing entirely. Paleontologists see it when new animal forms appear suddenly without transitional sequences, not because evolution failed to leave them, but because the sediments that might have held them were never laid down or were carried away by water or wind. Archaeologists confront it when civilizations rise in sudden complexity and then fade without enough surviving debris to trace their final years. Climatologists encounter it in cores where layers representing turbulent climatic spells are blurred or absent, lost to erosion or the trembling of ancient ice. Linguists note it when scripts die before their meanings could be taught, leaving behind signs that gesture toward vanished worlds. The pattern is not incidental. It is the structure of the archive itself. The first piece of this structure lies in the boundary layers that define Earth's deep transitions. A thin seam of clay separating one age from the next might look unimpressive, but inside it lies evidence of catastrophe. Iridium left by an asteroid, soot from forests burning across continents, shocked minerals formed by pressures beyond anything we experience on the surface. These layers tell us that the world changed in moments, yet everything leading up to those moments is sometimes invisible. The gentle decline before collapse, the fragile years when ecosystems faltered, the minute adjustments life attempted before failing or adapting, these rarely appear in stone. The rock remembers impact better than recovery, rupture better than endurance. And so the beginning of any new epoch is framed not by what came before, but by the line that survived. Another piece of the pattern appears in eras of collapse where entire records vanish. When palaces burned in the Mediterranean during the Late Bronze Age, the last clay tablets preserved only the final administrative breath of a world about to disappear. When the cities of the Indus Valley retreated and depopulated, the script they used went with them. When climate anomalies dried the Nile or shifted Atlantic winds, inscriptional evidence thinned precisely when it would be most precious. and when coastal settlements drowned under rising seas after the last glacial age, every artifact carried away by salt water became part of the unspoken world beneath our feet. Collapse is not only a historical event, it is a pattern of erasure. A related pattern appears in the fossil record. Radiations of new species often seem to burst forth suddenly. Cambrian animals, with their intricate body plans, appear without a clear lineage in many deposits. The first bats are already capable of powered flight. Early whales show impressive adaptations for aquatic life long before the sediments reveal obvious intermediates. Primates diverge earlier than expected, leaving only scattered fossils to hint at their branching. Large mammal expansions in the Paleocene and Eocene show similar leaps. It is not that transitional forms did not exist. It is that the environments they lived in were poor archivists. Shallow seas receded, coastal plains eroded, mountain basins filled too fast for preservation. For every fossil we recover, untold generations left no trace. Evolution is continuous, its archive is not. Another piece emerges in the civilizations that survive only in myth. When oral traditions describe drowned coasts, sky-wide anomalies, migrations triggered by vanished rivers, or lands reshaped by fire, they are often referencing real environmental or historical shifts. But the material record that would corroborate these memories is frequently gone. Wood rots in humid forests. Bone dissolves in acidic soils. Textiles vanish within centuries unless preserved by extreme dryness or cold. Entire cultural traditions, songs, ritual sequences, genealogies, can persist long after the objects that inspired them have disappeared. In such cases, myth is the sole witness that something happened. Not proof, but a shadow of proof. A voice carried across centuries when the ground itself has forgotten. And then there are the scripts that died before continuity could anchor them. Writing is one of humanity's most fragile achievements. It requires time, teaching, community, and stability. When those threads break, so does the script. The Indus signs, the earliest Aegean writing, the glyphs of Rapa Nui, the proto-scripts scattered across early agricultural societies. They all vanished because the people who understood them vanished, or shifted their worlds too quickly for instruction to take root. Without teachers, letters fade into shapes. Without context, shapes lose their voice. A script is not lost because clay or wood failed to survive. It is lost because people did. All of this leads to the realization that the gaps in our knowledge are not developmental mistakes or failures of excavation. They are structural. They emerge from the way Earth builds and dismantles landscapes, from the way climate moves in pulses rather than in steady lines, from the ways human beings store memory in materials the environment cannot keep, and from the ways populations change faster than their records can stabilize. A gap is not an interruption in the story. It is part of the story's architecture. It tells us that life in all its forms leaves only a partial imprint, and that what survives is as random as it is revealing. This recognition reshapes how we interpret evidence. Instead of assuming that the record is a puzzle missing too many pieces, we begin to see it as a mosaic intentionally incomplete, its meaning dependent on the intervals between the tiles. A boundary layer tells us something transformative happened. A sudden silence in inscriptions suggests communities faced stresses too great for documentation. A fossil radiation without intermediates hints at environments unsuited to preservation. A myth that aligns with geological evidence shows that lived experience can outlast material culture. A dead script reflects a moment when knowledge could not be transmitted, not because people were careless, but because circumstances cut the thread. To understand the past is to accept this structure without frustration. The Earth is not a library. It is a landscape that occasionally hardens into memory. Most of its stories are carried by water or wind before they can fossilize or imprint in clay. Human cultures are the same. We preserve what we can, often accidentally. A burnt scroll survives only because fire carbonized it. A ceramic jar endures because erosion buried it at the right angle. A bone tool persists because a landslide shielded it. Our inheritance from the past is a survivor's archive, not a comprehensive one. The silence around these fragments is not empty. It is full of implications. It warns us that every layer we touch is extraordinary simply because it endured. It suggests that for every artifact found there were thousands that vanished. It reminds us that the present moment is also fragile, also a temporary arrangement of materials and meanings that may or may not survive another 1,000 years. And it invites us to approach the past not with the expectation of completeness, but with the humility of knowing that we will always be working with remnants. Which leads us back to the final question. What does a gap truly mean? It means that what we know was shaped by the same forces that shaped what we do not know. It means that absence is evidence in its own way. And it means that our reconstruction of Earth's history will never be finished, not because we lack skill, but because the past itself was never recorded in full. And so we step back from the fragments, holding what remains. In the quiet spaces between evidence, we glimpse the strange truth that our story, Earth's story, was never meant to be complete, only discovered piece by fragile piece.